life is something interesting. Life has to use self-organizing processes to generate its order. This is the way that work, like heat, can generate order. It forces things to become regularized. It constrains the movement of molecules. It constrains the chemistry of molecules. Life has to depend upon self-organizing processes, or what I call morphodynamic processes. But it also has to stabilize, promote those self-organizing processes, and keep them from running to their end. So I'm a process. I'm continually actively doing stuff, dumping energy in the form of oxygen and food, and doing work, chemical work, to keep things going. I've got to keep it going. But in fact, I can now adjust to how much food, how much oxygen, how much work I'm doing, all kinds of ways, because the system has found ways to stabilize this. The question is, how do you stabilize these self-destructive processes? And the answer is you have to pit them against each other.
Terrence, thanks for joining me. It's such a great privilege to have you with me. I've been reading, watching you for over decades at this point. And my first question to you is, what is your conceptual understanding of the mind-body problem? How do you think of this from a historic perspective? When you think of the mind-body problem, what comes to your mind over time?
Well, first of all, it's a deep confusion. And it's deep confusion that goes all the way back to Plato. And that has to do with the fact that we think about the material world and the formal or abstract world as like they're separate things. Aristotle, I think, initially tried to resolve this by this concept he called hylomorphism. Hylo referring at the time to just substrate or substance. It really means effectively it's the word for wood. But hylomorphism basically for Aristotle was that there's no such thing as form without matter, and there's no such thing with matter that has no form. That is, they're always one and the same thing. And I've seen that as ultimately the problem that raises its head with Descartes, and then follows us into the present. And I think we're still living deeply in what I call deeply the shadow of Descartes in this respect. And that we can't even seem to think outside of that box. But I think Aristotle's hint is the right hint. And that is, there is nothing like information or mind or representation or semiosis without a substrate. It's something that's always substrate. But there is no substrate, no electricity, no neural activity that is not somehow formed, has not formed. I think one of the problems is that we have this sense of form that is, it's based upon our instincts about things like triangles and circles and things that are these abstract relationships, when in fact form is really just, a little bit less than chaotic. So any chaotic process that has a little repetitiveness to it, a little bit of redundancy, a little bit of regularity is formed to some extent. It's constrained so that not all of its possibilities are taken into account. And so I would say that also about mental processes, living processes, and so on. But I think the real challenge is this. And this is something that Aristotle does not have, which is necessary for understanding both life and mind, I think. And that is that the formal activity that a living process or a mental process is generating is about its substrate, about its necessary substrate. And the substrate is such that it makes possible the constraint of the future form of that substrate. And so that it's what Doug Hofstadter would call a strange loop. But here what I mean is a different kind. It's not just a strange loop like feedback is. It's a strange loop in which the form or the constraint determines the substrate. And the substrate determines the form in this complicated relationship. And so that everything, I think, is ultimately about my substance and about how my substance is part of the world, is part of the physical world. as is the constraint. But the issue is that the constraint is not something there in the sense that an atom is there. It's there in the absence to some extent. That's why a constraint is important. A constraint is just simply those things which are prevented, that don't tend to happen. And as a result, it's why we seem to have this sense that there's a dualistic aspect to the world, because it's the presence and the absence. But the key is you can't have presence without absence, and you can't have absence without presence. But in life, they have this weird, strange loop causal effect in which one is determining the other, playing a role in constraining the other. Each is constraining the other. So it's constraints that make themselves possible. It's materials that make the constraints possible. And that's the real challenge. What that means is we've got to get out from under this shadow. And I think we are impressed by this, in part because of the success of the computational world. In the computational world, if you think about what a computer is, it's Descartes incarnate to some extent. Even though Descartes himself said that computation should not be possible, in one sense. He didn't think of it in those terms, but he basically makes that claim in part of his reasoning. But the issue is very simple. What we've done with computing is, of course, we've created these devices, we've given them energy, an embodiment, and we let them run form, but the form has nothing to do with the embodiment. It plays no role in what kind of transistors, what kind of material is there. There is no strange loop. We have systematically created this Cartesian separation of the hardware and the software. And so we can now think about thought processes as software. Now, and we've only become more and more confused now that we've got these things like large language models that make it look like the machine is thinking. No, it's not alive. It's Descartes, and we're getting fooled by Descartes again. And so a lot of my work has been an attempt to sort of undo that.
I spoke to Keith Frankish about a week ago. We actually spoke for the entire Sunday for about 3 hours in a normal podcast, and then he gave me a lecture for about 2.5 hours. So it's almost 6 hours of my entire Sunday. Worth it. But the main topic of that was escaping Descartes' prison. So
yeah, good. I don't know his work, so it would be. I'm glad you mentioned it.
So Keith and Daniel Dennett worked on what is known as illusionism, and their focus is on illusionism as a theory.
So I know Dan. I knew him very well. We were in Boston for 20 years at the same time interacting, and over the years we continued to interact, even though we were on opposite sides of many of these questions. And Dan, of course, was trying to make that escape as well. And yet I think he fell right into it. And we continued to have this argument until he passed.
Terrence, why do you think he fell into it? Rest in peace, Dan. I mean, he's an icon that we all miss and love. It was great to have him in this consciousness conversation, sorry.
Yes, no, he's one of the most fun thinkers that I know of. We parried back and forth over the years. He became enthralled with Dawkins' notion of memes at some point. Memes, I think, are a misunderstanding of genes, because I think Dawkins misunderstands genes as well. And this is why it requires us to go back and talk about the nature of life itself. But Dawkins' idea was that things that just get copied, get replicated, are enough to make something alive. But in fact, there is no strange loop in this story. There is just patterns that get copied. And so when you translate this idea to cultural and informational processes, again, it has this Cartesian sense. So what it does is it tends to force you to say, well, that maybe that's just illusionary. There's nothing really there. It's just this material stuff. That's all we have to pay attention to. And the aboutness relationship is not really something unique. It's just an illusion. I mean, the obvious question is, well, who's having this illusion? And what would it mean to have an illusion in this story? I think it's self-contradictory ultimately. For the same reason. It's the reason that we've followed this reductionistic trend. We've said, well, maybe if dualism is a problem, let's just get rid of half of the story. Let's just ignore the constraints. Let's just ignore the form. Let's just ignore the aboutness relationship. Because aboutness, of course, is this relationship between something present and something absent. And that can't be real from this perspective, because absences disappear. So in any case, the good news is that Dan and I agreed and yet disagreed. And it was great for that reason.
He's not the only person. I mean, you've studied under Noam Chomsky and have had major disagreements with him.
Yeah.
With him. How's that been like over the years?
Well, so my interaction with him is, of course, when I was a young graduate student. I was in the Boston area at Harvard, and I took a course with him and interacted with him on and off over that time. We never really spent a lot of time working, quote, together. So I want to be clear that yes, I took a course or two with him, and in fact, I took this one course with he and it was an advanced graduate course with he and Jerry Fodor, the philosopher, who at the time,
to me that sounds like the most amazing lecture to be a part of.
Oh, it wasn't crazy. It was crazy, but of course, I was studying at the same time. I was studying neuroscience, and so here I am, interested in neuroscience. I actually came to Harvard initially as a young graduate student to study the work of Charles Sanders Peirce, the philosopher, and found out that I was having trouble getting to his work, which was there, but it was inaccessible to me. And I began to sort of shift over. Now, what I brought to that conversation with Chomsky and Fodor, of course, as this kid, here I am a graduate student near these famous guys, was this idea that, first of all, this idea of an innate universal grammar capacity. This is just biologically implausible to me. I knew, this is not the kind of thing you can think about in a biological sense. Yes, maybe philosophical, yes. But, biologically, how could it possibly come to be? And of course, Chomsky had this view that it couldn't have evolved, that it was just sort of this magic bullet that, a mutation that changed the brain and gave us this computational device. Well, first of all, I don't think the brains compute, so I think there's a problem, a deep problem there. But it's compacted with this view that Jerry had at the time that you can't even evolve this stuff. That is, you can't derive a more complex system from a simpler system. Well, of course, evolution is all about differentiating from less complex to more complex. So these views to me were just so weird. And so I was constantly in this battle. And we finally had a conversation. I had a conversation with Noam in which I said, let's talk about Peirce. At least maybe we can talk about this together. And I said, isn't the problem of acquiring language a little bit like abduction for Peirce? Abduction is this theory. So abduction is contrasted with deduction and induction. We can talk about that distinction at some point. But I said, isn't there a logic? Can we not talk about this sort of process logic of how we might be, in each generation acquiring language without having to have some special computational device? And he said, oh, sure, but Peirce's idea of abduction, that's just instinct. And I said, no, it's a totally different story. And we couldn't come to an agreement about this. So over the years, it's gone back and forth. In my book in the mid-90s, Symbolic Species, I sort of argued against the innate grammar device kind of argument. In a chapter I called Chomsky's handstand. He hated that, obviously. And his response to my work has always been, it's incomprehensible. It doesn't make any sense at all. And my response in return is, of course, that his idea is biologically implausible. So where do you go from there? But interestingly enough, decades and decades later, I've come to believe that there is universal grammar, although I argued against universal grammar at the time. And I still argue against the way Noam Chomsky would think about it. That is, that universal grammar is somehow biologically built in. I don't think so at all. In fact, I think it should have a capital U at the front of it. Universal grammar, in the sense that that we think of mathematics as universal. That is, we would expect that if sometime in the far distant future in a galaxy far, far away, there's a set of creatures that develop mathematics, they will eventually, if they keep working at it, discover something like prime numbers. Even though prime numbers are the exception to a rule. You know, they're not the rule, they're the exception to this notion of recursive subtraction, division. They'll discover it not because it's in the universe, not because it's in their biology, not because it is something that a culture could come up with, but because it's necessitated by the semiotic nature of quantity, of working with quantity. It's there. So my argument about grammar is that there's universal features that we share, that all languages share, but it's neither nature nor nurture. So one of the problems we've had, and this is it's kind of parallel with the dualism story, that we think there's only two possibilities. You know, well, the nature-nurture story is the same one. We think there's only two possibilities. Either it's there because of nature or it's there because of nurture. No, but there's another third possibility. It's necessitated by the semiotic structure of the process we're engaged in. And the semiotic structure, like a mathematical structure, has certain things. If you make certain moves, you're required to make other moves. If you eliminate certain things, you're required to eliminate and add certain other things. It's just, you know, to be internally consistent, that's what's necessary. I think you could say that about language. I think a lot of features of language are that way. So I've tried to basically lay out some of them and to pursue that question in some detail to say, look, we should be able to see these features in children as they acquire language. We should be able to see how they're not easily accessible to other species like chimpanzees that we're trying to teach language to. We should be able to, these are empirical questions, even though they're not nature nor nurture questions.
Terrence, there's something, I've got so many questions prepped for you, but while we're on this topic, I asked Noam, I think twice I asked him this question. How does he feel about the fact that linguistic capabilities might hinder us from explaining phenomena that are beyond the human comprehension, for example? Let's say we're trying to understand a certain concept. We only have a certain amount of vocabulary, concepts, viewpoints. How can we articulate what we believe consciousness is? Do you think this is something that might hinder us from understanding the heart problem or the mind-body problem?
No.
Okay.
To be very clear, I think that actually our symbolic capacities will allow us to deal with it. And there's a reason for that. And that is that they're, in a sense, our symbolic referential systems are detached in an interesting way. They're kind of ungrounded so that they are not limited by our capacities. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, we have the capacity to hold all the details in mind. And one of the reasons we use computers to do a lot of things is they can handle a lot of the details that we just don't have enough memory space to hang on to. But using these kind of prostheses, the prostheses of writing, of conversation, of accumulating knowledge, of using tools to expand this access, to give us you know, a vision into areas that we could not see otherwise, and to hold on to regularities and properties and laws that we are unable to see because they're just too complex statistically to hold into our heads. But once we have and develop these prostheses, these things that are progressively displaced from our own limitations, I think we have the ability to go there. So, so it's not like the argument where we would say that a dog will never understand the theory of relativity. That's not the claim I'm making. It's that once we have this this mode of cognition and this mode of shared cognition, and that's the important thing. This is not just limited to my head. You and I have to share this in order for it to work. I and my computing devices have to have an interface that allows us to sort of work together, even though the computing device is not a machine. It's just a machine. It's not a being in that sense. Nevertheless, it's a prosthetic, like we're using right now to interact with each other. And it expands this capacity. But that means that I don't think it's impossible. Even more interestingly, I don't think it's impossible for us to actually build it. Now, I don't think we're anywhere near that. And I think computing, as I said, is lost in Descartes' shadow. So we're not going to do it by expanding our computing capacities. But the fact that you and I have these experiences, that you and I are able to express these ideas. I mean, ideas, about the paradox of a strange loop, about infinities, about universal grammar, that kind of stuff. The fact that we can do that is just such a remarkable capacity, precisely because it's not in anybody's head. It's between us. And as a result, there's endless possibilities here. Now, here's the problem. We do get stuck. The Cartesian story is a story about being stuck for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, if we carry it back to Plato, thousands of years. It's a hard one to think. The reality of the world is very counterintuitive in many respects. And we just get stuck on parts of it. But if we can keep doing this kind of thing for another few centuries, that's exciting.
It is. I often feel like we're living in this new age of consciousness research. It's like a revolution at this point. So many minds getting together. This community online is allowing people to discuss concepts that were otherwise very separate entities. Someone would be sitting in one lab in the middle of Boston, while the other person in the middle of Cape Town, where I am, doing their own form of research. But now we're able to talk about this. I'm able to bring work from Mark Solms from Cape Town to Michael Levin,
right,
to these types of people who are bringing up different work, yet very similar in so many different aspects. And that's, by the way, one of the questions I came across quite often online is, it would be epic to see Terrence Deacon speak with Michael Levin. Are you familiar with Michael Levin's work, Terrence?
Michael Levin and I actually were at a conference together. He was online, I was in person in Notre Dame this last fall. And actually it was last February, I guess. He and I come from, in some respects, very similar backgrounds. In that, I as a neuroscientist and evolutionary biologist, and someone who, as I said, has this strong sort of Peircean angle driving my thinking. Although I don't consider myself a Peircean either. Michael, of course, comes from a background of evolutionary biology as well. I mean, I spent all the 1990s pretty much doing cross-species fetal neural transplantation to ask the question, how do developmental processes in the nervous system sort of build nervous systems that are different in different species? And he, of course, is working at a different kind of developmental range, particularly his early work with planaria flatworms, in which he was looking at how the structure of the body gets built, and yet we look at these two processes from, to some extent, very different angles, and I find it just remarkable that that's the case. We have never actually directly, the two of us, sort of tried to sort out these differences. I suspect that he has a bias towards what I call preformationism. Preformationism says that there's somehow a sort of a map there for how bodies or brains should be built, and that map gets generated. I am much more of a self-organizing thinker, that I think that these things emerge. That is, that they have to do with the particular kinds of interactions, and there's not really a sort of advanced plan behind this. But I'm probably caricaturing his work, and I want to be careful here.
calls it teleodynamics at this point. Sorry, no, you call it teleodynamics. He calls it teleonomy. And
Yeah.
your work's very similar. And by the way, he's one of the few guests who've been on the show more than 3 times. It would be great. I wish if I could get the both of you on together, it would be great to hear your views in one room.
It'll be a real challenge. So I think it'd be fun.
I think
But
that's exactly what the people want.
yeah, and of course, he worked with Dan for a long period of time at Tufts.
Yeah.
And so they have a lot in common. And I'm sure that he at least knows a little of my work as I know a little of his. But that's another feature of this. As all of this, there's so much to know. He should be reading a lot of my work. I should be reading a lot of his work before we ever sit in the same room together.
He's such a wonderful person. I
Yes.
swear to you, he probably has read your work and has a great deal of respect for it. That's the type of person he is.
That's terrific. Well, similarly, I think his work is so creative. I love the creativity of it. I interpret it differently, but that doesn't mean I don't really respect the creativity of it, because it's very out of the box, so to speak.
And
That is, he's taking a view of these same kind of processes that are not mainstream.
And that's a problem with the way people perceive these conversations nowadays, is that if 2 philosophers or scientists disagree with one topic, it means that they just don't like each other. And that's not the case. These are 2 people who have firmly dense beliefs in certain scientific views that they've accumulated over time. It's not that they just read one paper and decided to make a firm, fixed, false belief on this. It's that you've spent a vast majority of your life working on a specific project. And this is why you've come to believe what you believe. It's not to say you're wrong or right, but it's quite cool to see you disagree or agree with someone who's also quite accomplished. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, and I think that's why the interaction between Noam Chomsky and myself has been an interesting one. But again, there's also this sort of intellectual hierarchy. I came to interact with him as this graduate student from another background. And so that will never change.
Do you think that might happen when you speak to Mike?
No. Not at all. Not at all. We're both roughly of the same range. I'm a little older than him, but not by that much. I mean, when you come to intellectual history.
To us, I mean, in terms of intellectual history, you're a lot higher in the intellectual history hierarchy. So
I appreciate your thoughts.
It's a lot harder for us to look at it from that objective standpoint. It's quite tough to see you as equals, even though Michael's amazing. He's wonderful.
Amazing guy. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I should say in this conference we were in, it was actually a conference about teleology. And I'm quite a critic of what people have called teleonomy. My logic of teleodynamics, as I call it, is an attempt, and I should say there's a recent paper that just came out with another philosopher that just came out in Synthese. That basically, and I can send it to you if you'd like, that's basically an argument that says, now it's time to get teleology back into biology, to recognize that it's real teleology, that teleology is not unrelated to and necessarily related to representationalism. That is, teleology is about accomplishing a represented future. But a represented future doesn't exist yet. So the question is, you have to have a theory of representation. You have to have a semiotic theory to have a teleological theory. And to have a semiotic theory, you need a teleological theory. They're necessary because they're both about this relationship of presence to absence. And so teleonomy was an attempt to sort of escape that aspect of teleology that developed in the 1940s and 50s. That basically said, let's look at this stuff just like thermostats. Thermostats look like they have an end. They're organized so that they'll achieve some sort of end stage. It's as though they've got a tendency to go there. I think that's radically different than the fact that you and I had planned and thought about having this conversation, and eventually made it happen. This conversation that we're having now didn't determine what happened in the past. It's not the future causing the past. It's not backwards causation.
Mm.
It's something else. It's representation causing something to come into being. But a representation is not exactly something present. And that's the challenge. So that what was really necessary, I think, is this is why I begin from Peirce, even though I say I disagree with Peirce in many respects, that in effect, this is a really basic question. How is it that representation relationships come into the world? And they don't exist without life, as far as I can tell. I think you need something like life precisely because it has this strange loop, epistemological, ontological entanglement that allows, not just allows, but forces the future to be an issue.
I haven't even touched on the questions I prepped for this, but while you're on that topic, Terrence, when you looked up to people like Dan, Douglas Hofstadter, when they were writing their book, Strange Loops, Gödel, Escher, Bach, what were your thoughts? Were you looking at this bacteria to Bach and back versus Gödel, Escher, Bach, thinking, okay, these two are on different parts, but one person's more right than the other? What was your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that I want to be clear. I don't think that Doug Hofstadter, and I don't know him personally at all. And so what I'm about to say, you can take with a grain of salt in that respect. But he's thinking of it in the purely formal sense. I like to make a distinction between what I like to call Gödelian logic and Escherian logic for M.C. Escher. Now he puts M.C. Escher and Gödel together, right? Mm-hmm. Gödel's logic is a logic that's within logic. That is, there's no materiality to Gödel's story. Okay, he shows that self-referential relationships ultimately, what would have been called in those days logical type relationships, can't fully be separated. That you always get this sort of self-referential problem. And what Gödel proved that Russell tried to escape in the early part of the 20th century was that you can't actually ever rule out this possibility in any formal system that's well-developed. You can't rule out this sort of self-referential liar's paradox-like logic that undermines consistency or completeness, as we'll probably get to when we talk about incompleteness in the incomplete nature sense. But that's a logical argument that says that in a formal system, just a formal system, you're stuck with this problem. M.C. Escher played with these kinds of relationships as well, and of course Doug Hofstadter plays with them as well. But M.C. Escher has only one piece of artwork that actually captures what I would call the Escherian paradox. It's not a Gödelian paradox. It's more troublesome than a Gödelian paradox. So M.C. Escher has this one image, and you may know of it, and if not, I can send it to you so you can notice it, where this guy is standing looking out a window at a scene. And I think it's in maybe Barcelona or something like that, looking at a scene. And if you look at the way the picture is organized, it's twisted around so that he's actually looking at the scene in which he's a part. Now, that's what we're doing, right? And that's this entanglement of the epistemological, what I know, what I see, what I experience, with the ontological, what I am. They're entangled in a way that can't be disentangled. That's what I call an Escherian paradox. It's one step more complex than the Gödelian story. It's more complex because it involves the very medium itself that the formal relationships are laid out in. Kurt Gödel didn't have to worry about that. He's just worried about mathematics. Yes. But we living creatures are in this Escherian world. It's an Escherian paradox. It's this paradox that Descartes tried to separate off because paradox is so troublesome. It undermines itself. It forces incompleteness. So that's in a sense the difference. And so what I would say is I think that both Doug even in his discussions of this in his later works, and certainly in the stuff that he did with Dan early on, it was all at this level of logic. And as a result, I think still under the shadow of Descartes.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to escape Descartes' prison, as Keith calls it. Terrence, I've got so many questions prepped for you. Just to briefly outline the first three. One's about absence as causal power. The other one is about thermodynamics and self-organization. And the other is about teleodynamics and normativity. Let's start with the first one. How do you conceptualize the causal power of absential features in the emergence of mind and consciousness, and how does this differ from traditional materialistic causation?
Well, so the issue is that representational relationships, no matter how we think about them, are about something present in relation to something that's not present. But in a deeper sense, that is, what's present to my thoughts in our conversation are not part of the materiality. They're not directly embodied in any of it. And if my words have affected your thinking, they're also not embodied in the neurological activity. The meaning is not in the neurological activity. The neurological activity is just another physical process, like my sounds, like the electrons that are connecting us through the web, through the World Wide Web here. It's not what it's about either. The meaning is not in my head, not in your head, and it's not necessarily between us, but it's in all the things that are constrained from happening, in all the absent features. So that, think about I begin, I think the second chapter, it's actually chapter 1 in Incomplete Nature, with this little bit of the Tao Te Ching, the number 11 in the standard version. And I tried to translate it in a number of ways, looking at lots of people. I'm not anyone that knows Chinese, but I just simply looked at lots of Chinese examples and came up with my own translation. But it basically runs this way. He says, it begins with, he says, 30 spokes converge to the wheel's hub, but it's the emptiness that allows the wheel to turn. We shape
The
clay
absence
into vessels. What's that?
The absence has a causal power in itself.
Yeah, but notice it's a special kind of causal power, and this is why I think it's important to see. So we shape vessels out of clay, but it's the empty space that they surround that is why we create these. We carve doors and windows into our buildings in order to gain access to the emptiness that they protect. And he ends with this really interesting statement. He says, we profit from what is there, but we gain use from what is not there. Now, so the point of this is use is not something that's there. The function of my car is not in my engine. It's not even in the movement of the car. It's the use of the car and the engine and all that's together to accomplish something else. There's none of those things. The essence of the use is something that's absent, but it's precisely that absence which has shaped the design of cars. It's precisely the absence that has shaped the structure of a wheel with an empty space in its hub. And the point there is that the constraints, the things that are not there, are the way that we talk about the shape or the form of what is there. But it's what is not there that determines what is there in an interesting way. But what is there has to be made somehow. And this is again where teleodynamics, where thermodynamics is going to come into the role, because to make something physically happen, to constrain something from happening, takes work, takes effort.
I mean, Terrence, sorry to interrupt you, but my next question literally is, can you elaborate on how you linked thermodynamic processes to emergence of life, mind, through concepts like morphodynamics and teleodynamics? So I think this would be
Right.
a great way for you.
Huge concept. but so let's talk about it. I mean, first of all, one of the insights behind this, and we all know this, even though we've never put it into words. Stu Kaufman, one of my friends, Stu Kaufman, came up with this phrase in a piece that he wrote with a bunch of friends a number of years ago. He said that, to do work, we need to constrain the release of energy. But to produce constraints, we need to do work. What's really, this is a thermodynamic assessment of the concept of work. The constraints to keep something from happening takes work. You got to resist something. But it's precisely because you're resisting something that work can make something else happen. So the fact that the pistons in your internal combustion engine don't allow the expansion of gases to go in any direction, just one direction, you can use that constraint to move something else against the second law of thermodynamics, to drive your car uphill, for example. You can use the thermodynamics in one level to reverse the thermodynamics in another system. That we use in a sense, the increase of entropy in one system to decrease the entropy in another system, oftentimes. This is what we call thermodynamic work. But to decrease the entropy, to add form, to regularize, or to push something against this tendency, takes work. And so what this says is that if it takes constraints on the release of energy to do work, and it takes work to generate constraints, those constraints can now be used to do other work. The point I want to make here is this relationship between constraint and energy, and the release of energy, and what work is. That if you can generate constraints with work, since work takes constraints to do something, the new constraints that are generated might be able to do a new kind of work. So the key to evolution, to life, to thinking, to all of this, is just this very trivial idea that if you can generate work to produce some kinds of constraints, if those are slightly different or have some other features than the constraints that were originally necessary, you can now use those constraints to do work. In each step, there's a loss of capacity to do work. We know that continual, non-loss motion is impossible. So that there's always some loss in the capacity to do work. But think about driving your car up the hill. Now, I can attach it to, a stump that I want to remove and use the weight of my car rolling downhill to pull the stump out of the ground. I can do work on one system to create constraints, this potential energy that the car has now, to do work on another system, and so on and so forth and so forth. But what that means is that constraints can not only be created one after the other by doing work, but they can produce new kinds of work, continuously produce new kinds of work. New kinds of work can come from previous work. And if we recognize that information is always contained in constraint, in the form, then we realize that this is the key to information too. When I talk about evolution and how genes pass on something into the future, what are they passing on? Not chemistry, not work, but they're passing on constraints. Certain things that can't happen. Life works by virtue of the things that are not allowed. So I mean, this guy named Michael.
I once heard you mention the fact that you mentioned Dawkins earlier, but you don't see it as the selfish gene, but rather you see it as the lazy gene.
Yes.
That's a great way to conceptualize this whole process of this absence of constraint. This constraint absence is important to propagate.
In fact, my current work is all about that in a totally different domain. I'm interested in what amounts to the complement to natural selection. natural selection is a subtractive process. It removes things. You got to add things. Now, it was thought for a long time, all you're adding is new variation. The problem that was captured in what we were just talking about is variations are always variations of something. Something has to be generated. Those variations are constraints or loss of constraints that are passed on as work is done. So there's a whole side of natural selection that we tend to ignore. We only think about it, again, in a Cartesian sense, blind variation and retention of something. You eliminate things that you've created blindly. No, yes, blindly to their form, but work had to be done. This is a thermodynamic process. Natural selection is ultimately a thermodynamic process. Life has to generate excess in order to be able to eliminate something. We tend to think of natural selection without actually paying attention to the work. And what's the work doing? It's generating constraints. I'm an organism that's far from equilibrium, very unstable situation in the natural world, precisely because all these systems that make me up are constraining the possible chemistry that can go on. So that a vast, vast majority of the things that could happen with the chemical features of my body don't happen. They're kept from interacting with each other in certain ways, or certain things are made very probable that would have been improbable otherwise. The work of staying alive is the work of constraining things, of keeping things from happening. When I stop living, when my organism ceases to do all of this stuff, all those constraints are being released. Lots of chemistry can now happen that couldn't have happened when I was alive, or in which my body is preventing from happening. In some respects, it's not that I've lost life, but that the chemistry has gained freedom that it didn't have. Life is this process of generating constraints and maintaining constraints.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting you there, dear Terrence.
No, that's all right.
One of my questions further down the line was the role of constraints. It was, could you elaborate how constraints, which are inherently absences, can lead to creation of complex goal-directed systems, and how this differs from more reductionist explanations of life and consciousness? I thought I'd just bring that up now, since you've already sort of touched on that.
All right. Well, and interesting, if you think about constraint and reductionism, there's an interesting problem. If there's stuff, if something is made up of multiple things that are stuck together, you can now say, okay, now let me go down to look at the parts. Now look at the parts to those parts. Look at the parts to those parts. Okay. So stuff, has parts. Constraints don't have parts. Things that are absent don't have smaller absences that they're made of. Those constraints are always at a particular level. And so when you go down a step, a reductionistic step, you basically throw away those constraints at the upper level and you say, okay, irrespective of those constraints, what's going on down here? Oh, wait a minute, I can go down one more. Let me throw those constraints away and go down one more level. Now I've got, atoms interacting. Now I've got particles interacting. Now I've got quarks and gluons interacting. What's missing from all of that? Well, all the constraints on all those levels up above. Those constraints aren't doing something to change what's going on down below. They're not acting in an efficient sense to say, okay, I got constraints on top and they're making the things down on the bottom do what they need to do. No. They just emerge at that level. By virtue of the fact that some things stop happening, some things become less and less likely at a lower level, and as a result, at this next level up, things are constrained. So I'm not an advocate of what people call top-down causality. I don't think there's such a thing as top-down causality, but I also don't think there's an easy way to think about bottom-up causality. I think causality happens at levels differently because different kinds of constraints, different kinds of absences become available, become possible at different levels, and they cannot be reduced to each other. So emergence is not about the bottom producing something above it. It's about, again, this idea that this stuff just falls into place.
I think at this point, it's important to recognize the fact that emergent properties and physicalism in general, your framework is slightly different in the sense that you talk about what is called causal emergence. Do you want to perhaps define what that is and how it differentiates from everyone's day-to-day understanding of what emergence is as a phenomenon?
Well, so first of all, my view of emergence is like the term characterizes. It's a process. You've got to do something. And doing something is important. It's not just that consciousness is this higher order thing. No, it's done. It's produced. There's work involved. So my story is all about work. In fact, in my book, Incomplete Nature, I think the most important chapter and the least well-developed, from my perspective, is a chapter I call Work. Because we take it for granted. And we don't recognize how absolutely crucial it is. When I want to talk about causality, I'm almost always talking about work. Okay? And what that means is if I'm talking about semiotic causality, causality by representation, work has to be involved. It's not something that lacks work. This is why it escapes the Cartesian problem. If you bring work into the story, you have to bring constraint into the story. And if representations are always captured by constraints, by the form that's determined by the degrees of freedom that are not evident, that are absent, then that's why a representation can be causal, because it constrains work. It's a constraint on work. If a representation is constraint, if the transfer of constraint from one substrate to another substrate to another substrate is what information about something actually is, then of course it can do work to have an effect in the world because it's in the world. It's the absence side of what's in the world, but it's in the world. Presence and absence are necessary parts of each other.
I think
Let me give you my favorite example of this.
I was just going to say, I think the best way to do this is actually for you to give one of those examples, because I know you have quite a few that explain so beautifully.
So this is one that working in the laboratory has been the case for my work for years, which has to do with genetic information. We now have tools where we can analyze the structure of a gene. So I analyzed the structure of a particular gene for a particular substrate. One that I've been very much interested in is the gene that produces the enzyme that converts glucose to ascorbic acid in a lot of creatures. That was originally sequenced by a group in Japan in the mid-90s. They published this sequence in a bunch of research papers. And it's been, of course, copied in other research papers. And how's it been copied? Well, the sequence of nucleotides is captured in A's, G's, C's, and T's in a long list of A's, G's, C's, and T's in a particular order. And it's been published. In other words, this thing that was originally nucleotides, actual molecules in some animal's body, in some cell's DNA, is now in print as A's, G's, C's, and T's. And one article produces it, another guy looks at it, picks it up and says, oh, I'm going to put that into my paper and I'll so 10 years goes by, it's passed from paper to paper. I pick it up and I say, oh, here's a nice sequence. This is really interesting. And we've learned a lot about why it's not there in humans, why it's messed up in humans. But I can now take this sequence and use now my gene sequencer, my machine, and I can take the A's, G's, C's, and T's that were in typographics, ink on paper, and eventually transmitted by electronic media that I picked it up by downloading the paper, and now put it into my sequencer, produce the gene, and stick the gene in an organism. Now what's happened here? What have I transferred? Have I transferred A's, G's, C's, and T's? Have I transferred actual molecules? No, just constraint. The key is that constraint, so long as I can encode and decode it back to where it was, reground it, so long as those constraints are passed on without error, I've produced the same gene. And the gene will produce ascorbic acid in this animal's body that I've inserted it into. Now, it's not been done. Nobody could do that at this point in time, but it's feasible with the tools we have now. And we've now done this with many, many genes in many organisms, oftentimes just single-celled organisms. But we're really good at taking genes from one place now, getting the sequence, and then using that sequence to reproduce the molecule and put that molecule somewhere else and let it do its work. So this shows you that the information is in the constraints. The only thing that's been maintained across here are those constraints and the interpretation of those constraints. So we're using, in a sense, it's this idea of, you might say, encryption. You've got to have the right decryption system to get it back literally. But that's what these two machines are doing, encryption and decryption, so to speak. But that tells us that information, that aboutness, what its aboutness is, and therefore what its causality is captured in the constraints.
It's also similar to the you have one tell where you talk about, for example, different ape species in our brains, the evolution of our brains, and then you also talk about different species, how all the information's there. They've got all the access to all the data that's needed to have these experiences. However, it's what we don't do that make us different from what they don't do, which is pretty cool when you think about it.
Yeah. And of course, my early work in comparing brains, anatomy of brains, was to recognize early on in the 1980s in my PhD work, I couldn't actually, we didn't have the tools to find this out, but I couldn't actually identify, except for how big things were, what's different about the connectivity in a monkey's brain and a human brain in precisely the areas that we thought, we were fairly sure at the time, were involved in producing language. You know, these areas in the left hemisphere named for their discoverers, Broca and Wernicke. I was looking at the connections between them. We finally had the ability to use tracer molecules to find the connections, and I was sure I was going to be able to find the anatomical reasons why humans could do what they could do and monkeys couldn't do this. Well, no, I didn't find that. And in fact, it wasn't until now, 15 years later, 20 years later, that I'd done this work in monkeys, that people finally had the tools using what we call tractography, using fMRI, in which you could actually get a rough idea of what the connections actually were in the human brain. And by golly, the monkey brain predicted it. So it was a conundrum, why the human brain was able to do this and the monkey brain wasn't. They had the same connections. In fact, the genetics are almost identical. So the genetics won't help us out here either. In fact, it's one of these things where there's new information emerging somehow in this process, but it's not in a trivial sense. As you say, it has more to do with what's not there than what is there.
Exactly. So for like anyone listening who's not completely understanding what we're saying or what Terrence is talking about, is that all the information is there, but it's what we're holding back on or what we're stopping and putting constraints on that is making us as smart as we are. Because otherwise, the neurochemistry, the neurobiology, it's all very similar. It's not like you can look at a chimp's brain and think, okay, a human's brain has this much more that's going to predict better behavior or thought processes. It's actually now that we have a better system that constrains our variables that allow us to have these experiences, which is very different from what we often think about when we think of complexity. Complexity to us is give more, therefore you have more. Whereas here we're saying actually control more and you have more.
Right. And control is, of course, constraining.
Yes.
That's the challenge in all this. And it's a kind of interesting sort of mental reversal that you have to do. It's not easy, very counterintuitive. And so we often, and I would say that, I've mostly in my career not been able to think this. It takes a lot of effort to say, now, wait a minute, let me look at the other side of this before I jump to conclusions. And this is one of the reasons why I said a few minutes ago that I think we've had this problem with the theory of evolution itself. We have not been able to look at the absential side of it. Or rather, in terms of natural selection, we've only seen the subtractive side of it, and not actually understood that, there's this emergent side. Something needs to be generated. And once you have it generated, how is it generated? The interesting thing is variation. It's just an expression of the second law of thermodynamics. Things that are not preserved by natural selection just tend to degenerate. They tend to, but it turns out that the degenerative process is what's driving complexity.
It's almost like a complexity is merely the constraints of simplicity.
Okay.
Does that fit what you're talking about in a sense?
Well, yeah. I'm not sure. I have to think about what you just said.
Okay, but nevertheless, teleodynamics and normativity, your theory, your overall research posits that teleodynamics give rise to normative properties like purpose and function. So how do we reconcile this with the fact that
very good question
are traditionally seen as beyond the scope of physical science?
So what I tried to do in my book, Incomplete Nature, and it's really right in the middle of the book. It's where I tried to get to. And then from the middle, I tried to say, well, what are the implications of this in the last half of the book? The middle of the book is about how do you generate life. I think we've been distracted by a number of things, but one of the things that's distracted us a lot has to do with the fact that life seems to reverse what we think is the necessary structure of the universe, the second law of thermodynamics. Things tend to get more mixed up over time, and constraints tend to get lost over time. They get eliminated. It's just a spontaneous tendency of the universe. So when we look at living processes that are not only in our own lives, but certainly across the whole history of evolution, been generating new constraint, new complexity, new organization, it seems to be going against the second law of thermodynamics. So this was a conundrum, and in fact, it's, I think, really brought out intensely in the early 1940s by the quantum theorist Erwin Schrödinger in his What is Life, pointing out that, well, living things do something weird. They produce what he used the term neg entropy. I've never liked the term. There's no entropy is just a measure of something. You can't have a negative measure of something. But anyway, it's the idea of something that's the opposite of the sort of tendency to go towards mess. As a result, when we began to get excited, and some of the work was, a lot of this work was done by a guy named Ilya Prigogine, about non-equilibrium thermodynamics, seeing that there are some processes that actually can produce more and more order over time. My favorite example, actually, since I was a youngster, were snow crystals. Snow crystals grow spontaneously, and they have incredibly symmetric hexagonal form. And they have an almost infinite variety of these. It's not infinite. Not every snow crystal is absolutely different than every other one, but there are themes and variations in snow crystals. But in any case, these are processes that spontaneously generate order. And how do they generate order? Well, of course, they're causing water molecules that are sort of in Brownian motion in the air to attach to this lattice form and to grow. And they growing by virtue of giving up heat. When these molecules attach to the growing crystal lattice, they spread their heat into the system, they lose their heat, and it gets radiated into the world. It's the second law of thermodynamics process. But because of the changes in pressure, humidity, and temperature, you get slightly different patterns of crystalline attachment. But of course, the snow crystal disperses the heat evenly in all directions. That's number one. And so it's radially symmetric. It's got a number of other features, and that is at certain temperatures and humidities and pressures, you'll grow sheets or spires or prisms in the system. And so that as the snow crystal falls through different temperature, humidity, and pressure zones, it accumulates new molecules in a different pattern. So it's basically a memory of how it was formed. This is a process that's far from equilibrium. What's happening is it's far from equilibrium and becoming regularized because it's dumping its heat of acquiring molecules as fast as possible. The most efficient way it can dump the heat is the most direct route out. And so whenever you see something organizing itself, it's doing so in order to dump thermodynamics, to dump the heat, or produce the entropy out into the world as fast as possible. And the way to do that is to take the straightest possible route, the most direct possible route. Well, if you're a crystal, that route may be following branches, or it may be following sheets or something like that. If you're a whirlpool, it's molecules not bumping into each other, molecules that are moving in laminar flow. So if you're emptying your bathtub and you see a whirlpool forming, if you reach your hand down there and you stir it up and you mess it up, you never allow it to form, the bathtub will drain slower, because the whirlpool is the most efficient way, the most straightforward way for water molecules to leave the bathtub following the draw of gravity. Self-organizing processes like this are processes that are always in the process of dissipating energy in the most direct way possible. Typically, they form almost exclusively in very high gradient conditions, in which there's a tendency for things to flow very rapidly. My other favorite example are what we call Bernard convection cells, these little hexagonal convection cells that develop in thin oil, typically if heated from below. If you heat oil a little bit, the heat gets dissipated into the air by what we call conduction. That is, molecules bumping into each other. And of course, heat is a reflection of the velocity of molecular movement. But at some point, if you really heat it up to a high heat, bumping into each other sort of at random is just not an easy way to dump that heat out. The heat is going to accumulate faster than you're getting rid of it. So what happens is that the hotter molecules that are bumping into each other laterally don't move much. So heat stays there. Those that are moving vertically move the heat out of the system more rapidly, more efficiently. So that as the gradient of heat builds up, what you get is convection cells that form these hexagonal cells of upward dwelling hot molecules and downward flowing cooler molecules, downward flowing because they're heavier, because they're more dense than the ones that are going up. And you get this regularization, incredible regularization. It's getting rid of the heat as fast as possible. To keep it going, you need to continually heat it because it's dumping the heat as fast as possible. Like the bathtub is dumping the water as fast as possible under those constraints. Now, what's interesting is that each of those processes, because they generate order, have been looked at to say, well, life generates order. Life is like this. Maybe we can say life is just self-organization. The problem is maybe in part the word self-organization, because there's no self there. There's no self that's saying, do it this way. Yeah. We're using the term to say it's just not externally imposed.
Almost very
the form. Yeah. So I said, let's change the term. Let's call it morphodynamic. It's a dynamical process that tends towards form. But to tend towards form, it's got to be thermodynamically unstable. And how do you make a thermodynamically unstable system? Well, the convection cell story that I just told is a good one. You've got to have something flowing in and something flowing out, whether it's water in your bathtub or the heat in these systems. Something coming in, something going out. And in fact, once it's pushed beyond a certain level, to move what's coming in out as fast as possible, you need to regularize the flow. Regularizing it means taking the straightest possible path, the simplest possible path, the most direct possible path. And that turns to be regular. That's orderly. We consider it orderly. So when we see something that spontaneously generates order, we go, wow, that's unusual. That's a surprise. That's something exciting. And we look at life and we say, well, life is all about that. So life must just be self-organization. Here's the problem. Self-organizing processes destroy the very conditions that produce them as fast as possible. As soon as the water is drained from the tub, it's gone. As soon as the snow crystal falls to the ground or can't go any further or goes into a warm area, it no longer continues. These are processes that dispose of their boundary conditions as fast as possible. That's precisely why they become ordered. But it's precisely the problem with life. These are processes that, like the second law of thermodynamics, I like to call terminal processes. They run until they've maximized some value.
Yes.
Okay.
You call it
now,
the maximum entropy production.
Yes. In fact, this has been the standard way they call it, the maximum entropy production principle. It's not about just increasing and producing entropy. It's about producing it as fast as possible. It's a slight misnomer, because what's actually happening is you got to generate and offload entropy as fast as you're onloading a reduction of entropy. So reduction and calling it entropy is confusing, gets people confusing. Think about it as heat. So we're dumping heat into the system, pumping heat into the system, and the system is offloading heat as fast as it can. Okay, the key is that it will not go faster than a certain level. Once the amount of input and the amount of output are equalized, it's stable. It will continually look that way so long as you're dumping heat into the system and dumping heat out into the environment. It'll be organized as much as it can to sort of equalize the input-output relationship. It's not closed. It's a completely open system in this respect, both open to input and open to output. But that's what gets it regularized. The problem is, as soon as the heat is gone, or as soon as it uses up the heat, the process will stop. Life is something interesting. Life has to use self-organizing processes to generate its order. This is the way that work, like heat, can generate order. It forces things to become regularized. It constrains the movement of molecules. It constrains the chemistry of molecules. As a result, life has to depend upon self-organizing processes, or what I call morphodynamic processes. But it also has to stabilize, promote those self-organizing processes, and keep them from running to their end. So I'm a process. I'm continually actively doing stuff, dumping energy in the form of oxygen and food, and doing work, chemical work, to keep things going. I've got to keep it going. But in fact, I can now adjust to how much food, how much oxygen, how much work I'm doing, all kinds of ways, because the system has found ways to stabilize this. The question is, how do you stabilize these self-destructive processes? And the answer is you have to pit them against each other. The answer is the only way to do that is to have one self-organizing process that creates the constraints that make the other self-organizing process possible, but also keep it from running to the end. So one of the things I've tried to do is to say, okay, what that means is, no, if morphodynamics is the result of two competing thermodynamic processes, heat going in, heat going out, then maybe life is like pitting two or more morphodynamic processes against each other. So how would that look? So I came up with a fairly simple model system. And I've elaborated it over the years since I wrote Incomplete Nature into a much more complicated story. But basically, I said, let's just take the two most common chemical processes in living systems. One is called catalysis, how molecules can make other chemical processes more probable. These are processes that could have happened, but they're very improbable. How do we make them more probable? Well, catalysts do this. Molecules that themselves don't get modified, but they aid the others in happening. A number of decades ago, Stuart Kauffman sort of pioneered this idea that you can have what were considered autocatalytic sets, catalysts that catalyze each other and produce each other. I like to call this reciprocal catalysis. That is, catalysts that reciprocate to produce other catalysts. They all need substrates, but they're all, in a sense, that A produces B, which produces A, which produces B, and so on and so forth. The problem, that's a self-organizing process. It's a self-organizing process because by doing that, you'll use up the substrates faster and faster and faster until they're all gone and no catalysis can take place. And so all the catalysts will diffuse away from each other. All the potential substrates will diffuse away from each other. It's a self-organizing process. The other self-organizing process that we find throughout life is what's sometimes called self-assembly. Self-assembly is basically just crystallization. Molecules that have particular shape and electrostatic affinities with each other, typically hydrogen bond affinities, tend to stick together. And they stick together in clusters. Crystals are like that. They form lattices. But you can also form sheets. Snow crystals are nice sheets in this respect. So crystals can form into sheets. And of course, to some extent, all cells are sheets. But I became interested in a much simpler kind of structure, the shell of a virus. Shells of viruses are mostly made up of proteins. And proteins have interesting three-dimensional shapes that are semi-regular. And the regularity of it means that you can stick a bunch of them together and they form sheets that we call tessellations. It's like taking a bunch of hexagons and sticking them next to each other. You can fill space with it. Well, it turns out that the vast majority of viruses are made up of proteins that stick together to form polyhedrons, basically containers. Now, it turns out that all you need to do to produce those is, of course, produce lots of these molecules. We call these molecules capsids. Proteins are capsids. They form these little capsules. So when a virus invades a cell, it does two things. It takes its DNA or RNA, and it uses it to produce more DNA and more RNA, and it uses some of it to produce more of the capsid molecules. Now, the capsids tend to form into these enclosures, and if you produce lots of RNA and DNA molecules that are viral molecules, the capsules will tend to capture these, and the cell will break open and spit out these capsules full of their DNA and RNA, and they'll go and find another cell. But what I realized is that you could replace the DNA RNA, which makes viruses parasites on cells, with autocatalytic processes, with reciprocal catalysis. And that reciprocal catalysis, which makes more catalytic molecules, if it has a side product, if it produces yet one of the molecules it produces is not just a catalyst, but is a capsid molecule, then capsules will form where there's the most rapid catalysis happening. And will tend to capture and close the catalysts that make the capsule possible, but which also make the catalysts possible of making each other. What that means is the catalytic process creates the permissive conditions for crystal growth to happen. What are those permissive conditions? As crystals grow, or as capsules form, they use up the molecules. As a crystal grows, it will grow to the point where the concentration of molecules in the surrounding fluid is such that it's as likely that they'll attach to the structure as will detach. And so it'll stop growing. It reaches an equilibrium point. That's, in a sense, the termination process of this self-organizing process of any crystal growth. It goes to a point where the concentration has been reduced. Every time you suck a molecule away, stick it into the polyhedral shell, the concentration decreases. But if you've got a catalytic process going on that's generating new molecules to replace the ones that are taken up, that process will continue to grow until the capsid closes, till the capsule is now a fully enclosed structure. At that point in time, there's no new catalysis that's going to go on because it'll now use up all of the substrates. But all the catalysts that are necessary to interact with each other will be trapped together. Similarly, if you have an autocatalytic process like this, a reciprocal catalytic process, if it's not enclosed, as I mentioned before, it'll eventually use up all of its local substrates, and all the catalysts that need each other, that depend on each other, will diffuse away, and you'll no longer have this process to run. But by enclosing them in a container, now you've also produced the both permissive conditions and the termination blocking conditions, the constraints on ending, so to speak, that are necessary to keep the catalyst together. But now if you break open one of these structures, if it, for whatever reasons, for heat or for collision, breaks open, if it breaks open in a context where there's new substrates, catalysis will pick up again, and capsid formation will pick up again, and it'll repair itself. Now you have a system that is in a sense, self-repairing. It will change molecules, it'll take in new molecules, but it'll have the same capacity. What's maintained over cycle upon cycle, getting broken open, reforming, broken open, reforming, is new molecules will be taken in, and old molecules will be dispersed. After a few cycles of this, there's no molecules in common, and yet the same structure, which I call an autogenic or self-reproducing virus, is still there. The only thing that's in common is the constraints. That's all that's been passed on. No molecules, no energy is in common. But this is a system that, in a sense, creates constraints that balance each other, constraints or boundary conditions on these two processes, two morphodynamic processes, two processes that by themselves would terminate themselves. What they've created now is a system that is, in a sense, got termination prevention. It keeps itself from being terminated by keeping its component processes from being terminated. But to say that is to say that there's now a target. It represents itself, so to speak, in these constraints. And therefore, it can reproduce those constraints in new substrates. What this says is that replication is not at base. What's at base is self-repair. It's capable of, in a sense, to some extent, remembering what it was before it was damaged, even while it's damaged. It has a memory of it, but that memory is not in any individual molecules. It's in the system of constraints that holds the whole system together. So now I realize that, in effect, when we see that thing being passed on, repaired and broken, passing on constraints, that's effectively like passing on DNA. That a molecule could now have actually carried that same information. In subsequent work, I've shown actually how you can go from a system as simple as this. It's a simple thought experiment. Interestingly enough, it's an empirical thought experiment. We could do this in the lab. Nobody has done this. I don't have the facility to do it. Not only that, I think we'll probably find these eventually. I think there's going to be places on Earth and certainly possibly on other planets where we're going to find what I call autogenic viral structures. They're not viruses, they're not parasitic, because they don't use RNA or DNA. But they're like viruses because they have the structure of a virus. I think we'll find them, for example, deep in the earth, where they're not competing against life. We'll find them, I think we're going to find them in petroleum deposits, where there's lots of organic molecules, lots of heat. We don't know what to look for yet.
So at the lowest level almost on the planet, as deep down as you can get.
Yeah.
When you talk about this concept of autogenesis, it involves self-catalyzing systems that give rise to life. So what are the implications on theories of life in general when you think about this process and what we all discuss every day regarding the origin?
Right. So I think we've been hoodwinked by the Darwinian story here. Darwin recognized the last line of The Origin of Species Darwin recognizes that natural selection, the theory of natural selection, cannot explain the origins of life. He begins this last line by saying, probably won't get it right here, but there's there's majesty or something. I'll not get it right. In this theory of life, with its several powers being breathed into one form into many, and after which the Earth goes circling around the sun, and natural selection produces everything most beautiful and most wonderful have been and will be evolved, that kind of thing. But he begins that by saying, these special powers. These special powers are the powers of self-repair and ultimately self-replication. But the story that I've just told is one that says that self-replication is secondary. Things that just copy themselves eventually get noisy. The second law of thermodynamics wins. Catastrophe happens and they stop. Just copying is not enough. You've got to make repairs. You've got to remember something. And so you have to have a system that even when damaged, even when challenged, in a sense, has some kind of a representation. The key is that this is a system in which the representation is in the form of constraint. It's the constraint of the relationships between these constraint generating processes. It's a system of constraints, but this is why you need this third step. Why life is not just self-organization. Life is self-organization organized such that it keeps itself from terminating. You might say it's termination prevention. Self-organization is termination. Life is termination prevention. I'm spending my whole life doing that, so to speak. But what that says is that this story that we have today, that's the common story, that we think that life begins with replicating molecules like DNA or RNA, can't be the whole story. Because replication is, first of all, not about anything. It's not about the new ones that are going to be created. The new ones are not about the old ones. They're just copies of it. Like a molecule in a chemical reaction is like the last molecule produced in that chemical reaction. Eventually, even though it uses a kind of a template copying mechanism, that template process will accumulate noise and eventually will not be able to copy. You've got to have this kind of termination prevention. You've got to have constraint maintenance and constraint regeneration as a possibility here. What this says is that RNA and DNA are late processes, are late accumulations in the evolution of life. They're not what begins it. You've got to begin it in this systematic constraint relationship. It's a thermodynamic question. The thermodynamics comes first because there's work involved. The thermodynamics is the first part of the story. Then, if thermodynamics is organized in the right way, constraints result. And those constraints can be passed from substrate to substrate to substrate if you've got a system that protects and reconstitutes constraints. A memory system, effectively.
Before we take this back to the mind, so do you then think that this thermodynamic process occurs throughout the universe and is not just isolated to Earth?
Absolutely. But here's the interesting thing. To do this, you need pretty complicated molecules. Small molecules probably can't do it so well. I don't know how small would be a problem. But I would say that, we know that viruses on Earth are all done with proteins. Now, part of it is probably because proteins are made by cells and you need DNA or RNA and ribosomes and so on to do this whole process. It may be that it's possible with much simpler molecules, but not too simple. They have to have the geometry to form capsules. They have to have the geometry to form catalytic processes. The question is, to take this perspective, I'm not starting with anything complicated like a DNA or an RNA molecule, this long string of very unstable nucleotides. How do you generate nucleotides is another problem. But the key is that this is a process that's generic. Any fairly complex three-dimensional kind of molecule that tends to interact in these ways with other molecules should be able to do this. The question is, where do large complicated molecules like this show up? Polymers. How do they get generated? Well, we know on Earth, most polymers are generated by organic processes. But are there polymers elsewhere in the solar system? Yes. But it turns out that in water, polymers break down pretty fast. Water's a bad place to start with polymers. Where are polymers being produced then? Well, it turns out that we think that probably there's lots of polymers being produced in the outer solar system. Where? Well, think about Titan with its methane seas. Methane is a great solvent, an organic solvent. And one of the kind of things that can be dissolved in it is hydrogen cyanide. But hydrogen cyanide can form interesting polymers. Complicated structures in which HCN stacks on HCN, stacks on HCN, and we get this sort of CCN, CCN, CCN backbone of a molecule with side chains that are also hydrogen cyanide-like, but it will now have the possibility of folding into an interesting and complicated structure that could have, I don't know that it has this, catalytic and self-assembling capacities. But what this says is that in contexts where there's no water, it may be possible to generate fairly complicated polymers. Interestingly enough, these very cold conditions, water is like rock, effectively. And nevertheless, when it gets captured on comets that have grabbed some of the materials from these outer planets and flying into the inner solar system, and they dump their features, their ice and their molecules on the inner rocky planets that are warmer, what happens is, well, the rock, the ice, turns to liquid containing lots of these complicated polymers. I actually think that the process has to start in the outer solar system. But that means that throughout the universe, I think the raw materials for autogenic viral-like structures, which I think are the earliest, you might call them proto-life structures, are probably pretty widespread in the cosmos, because I think there's going to be lots of ways to do it. Lots of kind of organic molecules that can do this. But only when they come into inner rocky planets that are much warmer, where chemical reactions can go much faster, are they going to have the possibility to get much more complicated. So I think there's going to be lots of proto-life in the cosmos and a little bit of life. You know, it's one of these probability issues. There's going to be, you know, hundreds of thousands of times more proto-life out there. And once in a while, in some solar systems, there's going to be life. Now, the life will be a little different in each case. I think there's a lot of constraints on why it can't be too different. And we can go into that a little later. But basically, my argument here is that we're not so much seeded by life. We're seeded by this sort of proto-life that then can begin this process of complexifying. It complexifies because it remembers itself. And that when things change, things get modified, it still remembers where it was with now this little modification. Remembers that modification. Now, it's an accretive process. Information constraints can be accreted if you've got a system that remembers.
When you think of this, so the genetic hierarchy going upward or downward, depending on how you perceive this, do you think that still this comes down to one fundamental, let's say, atom, molecular group of structures that have come together? Or do you think this is just happening at multiple layers, different parts of the cosmos continuously? So there is no one single ancestor. There's just various different ones that will give.
So I think clearly on Earth, we're going to find that at least at some point we can go back to LUCA, a last universal common ancestor. Okay. Interestingly enough, LUCA we conceive of today as a cell that does all the things that cells do today. Has RNA molecules, has DNA molecules, has ribosomes, has tRNA, messenger RNA, all this stuff. No, there had to be a lot of evolution before that ever happened. However, all the other alternative forms got replaced. they didn't do so well. And LUCA, a particular way of doing this, took over because it's the most efficient way. It's very, very effective. I've been spending a lot of time on what I call the pre-LUCA evolution problem. That is, how do you get this complicated system where you've got, so for example, to produce 20 amino acids in sequence to produce a protein, you got to have corresponding transfer RNA molecules for each one of them. You've got to have a molecule that attaches the amino acid to a particular tRNA molecule by virtue of its antisense end. And these are called amino acyl tRNA synthetases. So each one of these has to have a synthetase that's relevant to it. It has to recognize it and attach a protein to it. The ribosome itself is made up of large number of proteins and a backbone, an internal backbone of RNA molecules that are specifically organized to organize the proteins of the ribosome so that they can accept tRNA molecules in sequence that have been charged with these amino acyl tRNA synthetases with an incredibly complicated process. How did this come about? And so I've spent a lot of time struggling with this. If the RNA world story is not a good starting point, how do you get there? How do you get to LUCA? And I think one of the stories is you have to give up the cell story. You have to go back to something simpler, like a virus. The problem is we think of viruses not as alive, but they evolve. We think of viruses as parasites.
Yes.
My argument is that you don't have to think of it in those terms. They don't have to be parasites. They've become parasites because this LUCA form was really great at producing stuff. So take advantage of it. And so now the only place we're going to find these autogenic viruses is places where there's, no daughters of LUCA.
Yeah.
So where's that going to be? Well, as I say, deep in the earth somewhere, maybe, or on Mars. Possibly in the atmospheres of Jupiter, who knows?
So it's a personality trait. They are parasites, but inherently they were never considered parasites to begin with.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. So the issue is that we've treated viruses poorly.
Yeah. I mean, even us as doctors, when I'm treating patients and we're talking about viruses, we still define it as we don't know. Is this life? No, we're not sure.
Yeah. And there's probably vastly more viruses in the world, types of viruses in the world, than there is any kind of cellular creature.
Mm.
We know that just by the statistics. When we look down, the bacteria just sort of outnumber us so vastly, and viruses almost certainly that parasitize bacteria outnumber bacteria vastly. But they're so hard to detect.
What are your thoughts on fungi, Terrence? Fungi, whatever people call it, fungi.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, we're all fun guys. Yeah. But the issue is, of course, fungi are one of the three major classes of multicellular eukaryotic organisms. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting stories to be told here. But so one of my favorite books from the 1980s was by a guy named Leo Buss. I don't know if you know this. It was The Evolution of Individuality. And he was interested in why is it that there are only sort of three major groups of what I would call addicted multicellular organisms. Now, by addicted, what do I mean? That they can't any longer be unicellular. Now, it turns out that there are unicellular fungi, there are unicellular animals, there are unicellular plants, algae, for example, or not hydra, but paramecia, that sort of thing. Animals and plants are single-celled, but multi-celled creatures, multicellularity has evolved multiple times, but it mostly is what I call facultative multicellularity. That is, in some part of the life cycle, they're a complex, like a Volvox alga, and then at other parts of the life cycle, a single cell can be on its own, swimming around until it finds others. Or until it reproduces into a ball. But animals like you and I, we can't do that any longer. Although we have single-celled phases of our life cycle, fertilized ova, and plants have fertilized ova, and fungi have fertilized ova in this process. We do it differently, but the question is, why do we become addicted to we have to have a multicellular part? In fact, you can say that our single cellular life cycle is always parasitic on the multicellular part of the life cycle. That's not true for Volvox, for example. So in effect, we got stuck. We got kind of ratcheted into this situation where we can't go back. What Leo Buss conjectured in the mid-'80s, well, that maybe there's sort of do you know this story about the theory of justice by John Rawls? No, he called it the veil of ignorance problem. And he said, if you want to create a just society, create it so that when people come into the world, they don't have knowledge about where they're going to show up. That is, if you know that you're going to be part of the royalty, then you've got a bias, and you can always take advantage of that bias. But if you come into the world and you have to be self-made, then in a sense, everybody's got an equal chance. So to produce an egalitarian world, you need a veil of ignorance, he says. It's an abstract idea. But the key is there's a kind of veil of ignorance story to explain how these groups got stuck. So first of all, the key is that where is the self-interest in each of these cells? Well, it's of course in the constraint maintaining part, the DNA and RNA of these systems. It says, okay, here's where this is what I'm going to be, how I'm going to adapt to the world and so on. All of my information is here. The key is, how do you keep it from being selfish so that one individual cell in the population can take advantage of the others? You got to have a veil of ignorance. So how does this work? And he said, well, there's sort of three ways that it can work, and they seem to be displayed in animals, plants, and fungi. So let's look at plants first. So now I've got one cell, and it begins to produce other cells. The problem is, how can that cell determine that my DNA, mine alone, and not any that's been varied in this process of generating other cells, will become the DNA that gets passed on to the next generation? Well, for a plant, a vascular plant like a tree or a bush, the only cells that can reproduce are going to be the ends of branches, the meristems. But in a plant, cells can't move. They have a cell membrane that has a cell wall around it that gets stuck to neighboring cells. So that cell that starts the process can't decide, oh, I'm going to move out to the meristem and become the one that reproduces. So wherever a cell is produced, it's stuck. It can't determine that its DNA are going to be the stuff that gets passed on. So now you're required to cooperate. You have to be there's an egalitarianism here. We can take advantage of that by grafting some plants on top of other plants, for example, because we know that the rootstock won't be able to take advantage of the fruit that's produced, that sort of thing. So we can take advantage of it. We can, undermine what the plant has got stuck here. This is why the plant's stuck this way. Why it is now forced to be cooperative with each other. All the cells have to cooperate to produce a larger integrated organism. But now let's go to fungi. What's the story with fungi? Fungi have very leaky cell membranes, and some don't even have cell membranes. So the only real serious membranes are the membranes around the nuclei. But that means that nuclei can move around oftentimes in this sort of larger pseudo cell. As a result, what you see in fungi is very little tissue differentiation. Take a mushroom. If I eat the veins of a mushroom, eat the stem of a mushroom, eat the cap of the mushroom, the cells are effectively the same cells. They all taste the same. Although there's some differentiation, for the most part, fungi don't have this capacity to differentiate their cells very much. And as a result, they're fairly morphologically contiguous. That each cell is like each other cell. But this process means that no set of genes, because the gene products get now dispersed among everybody else. I can't determine that locally my little group are going to be the ones that make it, so that when I produce a fruiting body like a mushroom that pops up out of the ground, it's whoever was there at the time. It's like the meristem story. But in this case, it's because nobody can determine the local environment. It's all messed up. So he said, that's another way to produce it. So what's the story with animals? Well, the story with animals is you do it a third way. And that is the mother produces this big cell called an ovum. And in the ovum, she has its genes producing, and her genes producing a lot of the RNA and protein in that system. It's already there. It's already doing its work. Now, the sperm comes in and fertilizes this egg. Now you've got two sets of genes. Its individuality is now this combination of genes. But that combination is going to take a time to produce its own proteins, its own ribosomes, its own RNA. So that actually for the first many cell divisions of an animal embryo, it's mother's DNA that has determined what's happening. So now the individual cells, it can't determine it. Mom's determined it. So in effect, mom has said, now you're going to, I'm going to determine who's going to be a heart cell, who's going to be a nerve cell, who's going to be a gamete cell that can reproduce into the future. That's going to be determined simply by where you are when all the cells divide.
Is the biological, let's say, is there a pro to this? Is there some sort of advantageous theme to this occurring, or does it not matter because when you look at bacteria and viruses, they still propagate as much, if not more than us?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. What I would say is that this is just a kind of addiction, a kind of ratchet problem. Once we moved in this direction, you can't go back.
Okay.
Once your single cell phase becomes always parasitic on the multi-celled phase, you basically can't go back. And this is actually the theme to the book I'm working on now, which is called Falling Up. But basically, the theme is this, that once you become dependent on somebody else, you tend to degrade your own capacities to be autonomous. Once you've got something to rely on that's reliably out there, why do it myself? It's the lazy gene story. That if there's no selection to maintain it, let it go. But if you let it go, you become dependent. It's a ratchet. It's a one-way street. And it's the result of degradation, loss of autonomy. Loss of autonomy, nevertheless, forces you to be more complex. Because now you've got to rely on something else, and that will then rely on you. So the multi-celled part relies on the single-celled part to reproduce. If you think about it, for us, I can't reproduce without sperm and eggs.
Is there a subheading to Falling Up? Have you thought of something?
Yes.
What is it?
The subtitle is How Inverse Darwinism Catalyzes Evolution.
Okay. I like that. Just making a note.
Yeah. So obviously I'd have to explain inverse Darwinism.
Yes. Please go ahead.
The idea here is as I've described. And it's a recognition that we talked about of a problem we talked about at the beginning, which is that you have to produce something, that life always has to produce excess in order to stay ahead of the second law of thermodynamics. But in producing excess, you're producing duplicates of things. But what we've learned from information theory is that duplicates or redundancy is a way to deal with noise. So if you're having trouble understanding what I'm saying, I can repeat it again, or I can give you another example of it, or something like that. Or if we're talking to each other across a noisy room, I have to repeat myself many times, or wave my hands or whatever. Redundancy, we know, is a way to deal with noise. So that's great. So noise is happening, of course, all the time. But there's another side to redundancy here, and particularly in life. If you always have to produce more of things, you have to redundantly produce genes, maybe. Then one of the things that happens is that allows you to also tolerate noise. So if you have a redundant system, already you can tolerate noise. So if I've got a system in which like in the English language, there's a lot of redundancy in what letters can show up next to each other. A lot of redundancy and constraint become part of each other here in the story. Redundancy is about the same constraint, about the possible variety being constrained. So in a signal that's got redundancy, there's a lot of constraint. Not a lot of things can happen. It holds less possible information with more redundancy. But with redundancy, we can tolerate noise. So with living systems, if you produce redundant parts, you now have sort of a backup. We learned this initially all the way back in 1970, and it's only really been brought to the fore in the last 2 decades. And I think only very recently have we begun to realize how important it is. In 1970, a Japanese geneticist named Susumu Ono wrote a book called Evolution by Gene Duplication. And what he was talking about was not reproduction, but how when you looked in the genome, we were just beginning to get a sense to look in the genome in 1970. What you see is that sometimes the same gene gets copied right next to itself. These things called transposons, there's various ways this can happen, can grab a chunk of DNA and stick it on next to itself, or stick it somewhere else in the system. Or retrotransposons can take an RNA molecule and transpose it back into a DNA sequence and stick it somewhere else. Well, it turns out that the human genome is full of transposons, full of duplicate genes. They're just copies of each other all over the place. Now, the question is, what's going on under these circumstances? Well, a couple of interesting things is that if you have copies of it, there's a couple of things possible. So one of the set of genes that we have lots of copies for are, for example, tRNA, transfer RNA molecules. We have over 500 genes that are really good copies of the 20 different tRNA molecules. And they're dispersed all over the genome. The reason for this is we have in each cell tens of thousands of ribosomes constantly at work producing proteins using tRNA. We've got to produce a lot of tRNA. So best to have a lot of them to do it. But the problem with a lot of molecules, a lot of genes, is that the body is set up so that you got to have just the right number, just the right concentrations of proteins. A good bad example of this one is what we get with trisomy 21, Down syndrome. The smallest, one of the smallest, except for the Y chromosome, simplest autosomes, the 21st chromosome, in trisomy just simply doesn't get separated off during meiosis, and so you get 3 of them. But that means you get not twice as much protein produced, but 2.5 times as much protein produced. You get a little bit more protein produced. But it turns out that having extra amounts of protein produces all kinds of problems. It's a dosage problem. You're just producing too much protein. And so all the effects we see in Down syndrome are the result of this, including early onset Alzheimer's and things like that. So not everything can work by just producing lots more genes. But what happens is oftentimes when you have multiple genes produced, you now have a backup. So if something goes wrong with one of the copies, the function is still there. And so that copy can degenerate and degenerate and degenerate. And we have a lot of what we call pseudogenes that are the result of this. Two of my favorite examples. One is 3-color vision in primates. It's the result of the gene that produces the color receptor molecule that we call an opsin or rhodopsin that we see in the cones of the retina. It turns out that a gene, we have 3 genes for producing 3 different opsins, one for the blue, one for the green, one for the red end receptors. Well, it turns out that most mammals only have 2, one for the blue and one for the green. And they're called dichromats as a result. We're trichromats, and about somewhere around 50 to 60 million years ago, primates, as they came into sunlight, interestingly enough, developed a 3rd copy. And they did so by the green opsin gene was copied right next to itself. So we got 2 of them. They're redundant of each other. So one of the things that happened is one of the redundant ones began to degrade. Because, well, you've got the function, you're producing color vision, you're producing light reception, just let it degrade. You've got one already there. How did it degrade? Well, it degraded and then it couldn't take on as much high frequency light. It became redder and redder and redder in its sensitivity. But now we have the possibility of something that is picking up the low end of the greenish spectrum. Now the green one doesn't have to pick up as much red. It can be more shifted in the bluer direction. So now we have 3 not quite evenly spaced rhodopsin proteins that are produced. And luckily, each cone gets a different rhodopsin. A different gene gets expressed in each cone. So now we have a cone for red, green, and blue. And they're sending us information back to the nervous system, now getting different information, and their combinatorial interactions produce this capacity we have to see in color. So here you see gene duplication and degeneration because of redundancy, because of error, you might say error protection. The loss of function was not a problem. It was tolerated. But this tolerance allowed it to degrade, but degrade into a likely, potentially, usefully, synergistically interacting molecule with the one that was already there. Why? Because it already had the function of taking on light, just degraded a little bit. And now its function is slightly different, but the probability of interacting with the other one synergistically, producing something novel, is much, much higher, precisely because they came from a common background. Well, this turns out to be the case all over the place in the genome. This is why I call it falling up. That is, the new function, the more complex function, was the result of actually redundancy, duplication, and degradation. But what that degradation did is it produced the opportunity for interesting interactions. And those interactions, if they become useful, now natural selection can maintain them. It won't just degrade into nothing. Now, it turns out that a similar thing happened with us and vitamin C. With us and vitamin C, as I said, way back, I've mentioned this before, way back in the mid-90s, a group of Japanese researchers went to the rat genome and they looked for a gene that might be associated with a protein that converted glucose to ascorbic acid vitamin C. It does so endogenously. Rats don't need to eat fruit. In fact, very few animals need to eat fruit. A few birds do, a few bats do. And monkeys and apes all do. That's because we have the gene, a fossil of the gene that produces this last enzyme that produces vitamin C endogenously. But ours is full of noise. It's accumulated so much damage that it's become a pseudogene. It looks like a gene. It's got some of the same features, but it's got all kinds of problems in it. It's got stop codons in it. It's got a frame shift, which makes it all nonsense, and so on. And it's slightly different in each primate lineage. But they've all had this one degraded. It's degraded because of somewhere between 50 and 60 million years ago, primates stopped mostly eating insects and started eating fruit. And to eat fruit, you better look at it and discern, whether it's edible or not. Well, fruit has always had its seeds dispersed by birds, which always could see in 3 colors. Birds are always trichromats, some more so, in fact, than even primates. But how did fruit advertise to birds that now is a good time to eat me? Well, there's a couple of things. The fruit had to produce something that birds want. Gotta have sugar, right? So sugar is a great thing for an animal that has a high metabolism and needs to fly around. But having them flying around is a great way to disperse seeds. So take advantage of birds. But now the key is my seeds are not going to be ready. And the food that I've got for the birds is not going to be ready for a while. It's got to mature a bit. How do I advertise to the birds that now's a good time to eat me and to take my seeds and poop them out somewhere else? The answer is color change. undergo color change, stay green to be like leaves, indistinguishable, and then suddenly change to blue or orange or red that contrasts. But if you're a dichromat, you can't see this. Now, why does this link to the vitamin C story? If you ever cut open an apple and leave it out on the table, it turns brown, right?
Yeah.
That's because the sugar gets oxidized. The way to keep sugar from becoming oxidized is to have ascorbic acid. So fruiting plants had to dump ascorbic acid in with their sugar, have lots of ascorbic acid. But now as primates begin eating fruit, they're getting lots of ascorbic acid, which is redundant with the ability to produce it themselves. And so it masked natural selection and allowed this gene to degrade. But now we're addicted to fruit. We get scurvy if we don't eat it. You know, Magellan lost half of his crew sailing around the world because of scurvy, because they weren't eating fruit. We're addicted.
Yeah.
But now we have a bunch of other things. I like sweet. I like sour. I can see in 3 colors. I have a transporter molecule in my blood that carries ascorbic acid from cell to cell to cell more effectively. I have other antioxidant capacities as well. So this changes, in a sense, now there's this higher order relationship between us and fruit, but this is the same kind of relationship that produces addiction to other things. This is a kind of addiction. When I talked about the addiction of single-celled organisms to their multi-celled life cycle. Well, it's an addiction of the same sort. You've lost some capacity, and now you're stuck with this other capacity. So I call this inverse Darwinism, because what's happening is these results are the result of relaxing natural selection, of tolerating noise. Duplication processes make this more likely and make synergies more likely to show up, complexity more likely to develop. It's a totally different kind of logic. It's inverse Darwinism, not because there's not reproduction, not because there's not variation. Those are all there. Duplication is like reproduction. Variation is degeneration. It's the second law of thermodynamics. It's just that this happens in a context of error tolerance. No longer competing for resources. Resources are always there. 2 genes, okay, they're both there. It doesn't take a lot of extra work. There's not a cost, not a significant cost. So it's the inverse of natural selection because there's no selection. The third part of the Darwinian story, selection, competition, is irrelevant. It's not about cooperation, though things may end up cooperating because they're forced to, because they're addicted to each other. It's not about cooperation, but it's simply about the relaxation of natural selection. There's no selection. Under the lack of selection, you overproduce, more combinations are possible synergies can show up, possible interactions, and therefore more degradation can take place. And things can become more codependent, more addicted to each other, so to speak.
And
that's a big part of the evolution story, and that we've missed it all along.
From a teleological perspective, since that's a big part of the work, where do you see this sort of heading toward then? If you had to propagate moving forward, where are we headed?
So first of all, I see these 2 logics. I see that we have to think of these 2 aspects of the evolutionary process. It's you might say, inverse Darwinism is the yin of Darwin's yang, selective yang. You need both. You need an additive process, a complexifying process, and a simplifying, subtracting process. They both have to work together in the same sense that the 2 self-organizing processes I talked about originally in the autogenic virus story have to be counters to each other. They have to become both the boundary conditions for each other and the limiting conditions for each other. You've got to have both. You've got to have this interaction. Well, this kind of dynamic is what evolution is about. Evolution is not just natural selection. It's this combination. And that means processes that are evolutionary, wherever we find them, are going to have this logic, this 2-part logic, this yin and yang logic. That includes the kind of evolutionary process that thinking involves, that social development involves, that the addiction we have to a shared form of communication, language, how it evolved. We became addicted to it. My book, The Symbolic Species, is about how we became addicted to this shared distributed thing that we need each other for. Language can't be maintained by a single individual. It's not innate in the sense that there's not an autonomous language device built into us. It's something that self-organizes selectively in a social process. It has its collection. We're addicted to it in the sense that single cells are addicted to the multi-celled organism that they need to gestate in. We need to gestate in this social soup that we call a symbolic world, right? We're addicted to it. And what I would say is our brains don't even work normally if we don't get raised in this environment. Our brains expect this. This is part of the condition of normal human development. But this had to evolve by the same kind of mechanism. And it has to work neurologically by the same kind of mechanism.
There's so many different aspects of your work that's so fascinating. I wish we could literally speak for hours, but because of the fact that we started with the mind, we went into life, before we head towards the rest of the questions, I want to take us back into the mind. What I would love to do, Terrence, is in the future, obviously take a specific aspect of your work, maybe a paper, a specific part of your book, and we can go into great detail about that specific component, because I think it allows us to explore and expand on that a lot more. For now, I want everyone to understand your work in a very general perspective, even though that's pretty much impossible. But when you wrote the incompleteness of nature, when you talk about that factor, can you clarify for everyone who's watching or listening? I'll put a link to the book in the description. It's a wonderful book. I read it a few years ago and then again recently. How does it relate to your broader argument about the mind's emergence?
Very good question. Well, so first of all, go back to what we talked about early on in this process, the hylomorphism, that strange loop between the constraints, the information, and the substrates that information is carried by. That is, living processes create that kind of a strange loop. So the question of consciousness, I think, has to do with the fact that we are physical, that everything about what brains evolved to do is to maintain that physical relationship. But neurologically, you can say that our neurological processes are a strange loop within a strange loop. That is, our bodies are what I call vegetatively sentient. They respond, irrespective of my nervous system, to the world in a variety of ways. And we see this even after a person dies, their fingernails keep growing, their hair keeps growing, and that sort of thing. Because biology itself has this strange loop of information, of replication, of repair, of continuation. But animals have this interesting problem. Animals, unlike plants, are not rooted to the ground. They don't have to just respond to what's immediately around. They can actually change the context by moving from here to there, by following resources, by all the things that we do. But to do that, you've got to do predictive work. You've got to represent something that's not here now, and then move towards it. Even if it's as simple as anticipating what's 50 feet in front of you. Maybe it's just a smell gradient that you're going to follow. You've got to have something that predicts. And so we have this whole system that does so. I think that the nervous system has its own teleodynamics. So I like to distinguish these two by saying that there's that teleodynamics produces vegetative sentience. Sentience meaning simply self-repair, responding to the world. Plants do this, bacteria do this. There's this sense of that they're responsive to the world with respect to their needs, so to speak, but in a very simple, direct way. animals have added an extra, you might say, an extra cycle upon this. That is a self-organizing, strange loop teleodynamic cycle within the teleodynamic system, because it's got to do this prediction stuff. But it's got to do prediction with respect to my body needs. So it's doing its prediction with respect to what the teleodynamics of the rest of my body is doing, whether I'm, a really simple animal or a complex animal. And in this process, there's got to be, within the nervous system, its own teleodynamics. The key to teleodynamics, it's about the generation of self. The term self-organization is a misnomer, but I think a teleodynamic system has self. This is why it can repair itself, why it can reproduce itself. It's not just pattern. It's, in a sense, its own embodiment. Well, the key is the nervous system has to be doing this as well. So I have a body sentience, what I call the vegetative sentience of my body. And then there's the vegetative sentience of the nervous system. I think the nervous system itself has a kind of vegetative sentience. It's a kind of a closure, so that it has this process that involves metabolism and so on. That's also physical substrate. Neurons are trying to stay alive. They're getting perturbed by information coming from other nervous systems, from other neurons. And they're just trying to stay alive in this maelstrom of signals coming in and causing their metabolism to go up and down. But now, since the one is inside the other, is part of the other, is maintaining the other, we've got a teleodynamic process about a teleodynamic process, a process that's a strange loop about itself as well, because the body is keeping the nervous system as well. So there's a strange loop linking strange loops, so to speak, in this respect. That's what I think animal nervous systems provide. Now, what that means is that we're not only aware of our body, of the substrate that we are, but it's the very substrate that is linked to the world, that is structuring, that is the constraint on the dynamics of the brain. And the dynamics of the brain, of course, are moving us around in the world, changing the substrates on our body. So it's what you might call a strange loop between two strange loop systems. It's that complex. But that's why we are in the world physically, why I have a self. I have a self precisely because that self is physically grounded, because all of the constraints are physically grounded, and they're about themselves and they're about the substrate of themselves. So I've recently become very much involved in looking at the metabolism of brain function, recognizing that I think that emotion, that feeling, the drive feeling, the feeling of need, the feeling of something has to happen, or the feeling of resistance that we feel, the feel of being, is about this relationship between the information and the physicality, and the fact that we're doing work, that everything that a neuron is doing is work, and that work is resisted, can be promoted and resisted. And I feel that. We're thinking. Now, forget the thinking part of it. Thinking feels like something. This is because there's work involved. And work feels like something because there's resistance. Work is always against something that's resisting. And what's it resisting? There's constraints. And the information itself is constraints. Strange loops about the relationship between strange loops. This is, I think, the problem of consciousness and why it's so difficult to get to it. Once we have taken the Cartesian pill, we drunk the Cartesian Kool-Aid, and we think that information is somehow this disembodied separate stuff. We lose the possibility of even doing this. If we begin to look for the neural constraints of consciousness, trying to find it somewhere, it's not going to be there. It's in this complicated relationship. So I have to say that I think we're still fairly primitive in asking the question about what consciousness is, for precisely this reason. We are still in the shadow of Descartes. We haven't really recognize the Escherian paradox here.
Mm. What a lot of people like to bring up the aboutness of experience when they talk about qualia or the subjective phenomenal experience of reality. And you have two specific definitions and words that you use in your work: absential and intentional. Now, for all of those listening, this is different from intentionality, which also I'll allow you to define, Terrence, but you've now spoken about what is called intentionality. So what role does absential and intentional properties have when it comes to understanding the framework of mind and life, perhaps?
Well, again, the story of absential is very straightforward when you think about it, that all representational relationships are structured by virtue of something that they're not. But we could say the same thing about all living processes. They're structured by virtue of something that they're not. But they're structured in a way that maintains that relationship to something that they're not. And they do so by virtue of the constraints. But the constraints are about what's prevented. That's something that's not there. So that relationship is the key to that story, and that's what's going to get us to the strange loop, what I call the Escherian paradox, the fact that we're hylomorphic in a much more complex and interesting way. So in that respect, what that says is, why is there a feel to things? Why does it feel like something? What does it feel like to be a bat? That kind of question. It's the qualia question, but it's not that qualia are things out there or this other stuff. Qualia is the result of this entanglement of information with physicality. It can't be disentangled. And because of this, there's always something incomplete about this. Why? Because there's something absent always involved. The structure of things present are there because of what's not there. Again, go back to the Taoist statement. Things are structured by virtue of use, but use is about the future. Use is about what's possible, what's potential. It's not about what is alone. It's just that what is now, in some cases, going to be constrained by what's possible, what's made possible. So that's why I see these linked, and it requires us to rethink how brains work in a fundamental way. It requires us to stop thinking about brains as doing computation. Brains are not doing computation. They're doing something more like life. In fact, it's why living information processes feel like something. Machines don't feel this. Why? Because the information that's coursing through them has nothing to do with their physicality. Yes, it's physically embodied, but it plays no role in the structure of the system. It plays no role in what it's made of, or what will happen if it begins to break down. It's got no skin in the game, so to speak.
Would you compare this to what 4E Cogsci call like inactivism? Would this be a similar concept in that regard?
I think it's similar. The problem with inactivism is I think it's still Cartesian. You'll notice that we enact things, but to enact something, you got to do work. If you leave the work story out of it, and how enacting comes to be, you're still in this Cartesian world.
Do you think it's more of a property dualism at that point? Less completely dualistic, but more kind of assuming a property dualism?
I think, I'm not sure I would say it that way, but I think it's leaning in that direction.
I see.
And so what I'm trying to get rid of is this property dualism. What I want to say is that Descartes' cogito is the constraint absent side of Descartes' res extensa, physical stuff. That is, Descartes simply separated the absence and the presence that can't be separated.
Mm.
So it's not dual properties.
Has to be one.
Yeah.
How does your approach address the traditional mind-body problem? We started by asking for your philosophical history of it, but what new insights does your work, or what would it offer regarding the relationship between mental and physical states?
So first of all, it would make that question
In
foolish,
there is no
right? There is no difference. They are the same thing, but we got to recognize that they're aspects of the same thing. It's not dual properties, it's aspects of the physical world.
I always love asking that question, because the podcast is called Mind Body Solution, because technically then this podcast is it's nullified. There is no mind body solution, because it's just a mind.
Yeah, that's right. It's not separate.
Exactly.
So, but another way to think of this is, I see this all the time, particularly in more philosophical writings about the brain. They talk about the mind/brain.
Mm.
The mind/brain is just a way to say, I'm not a dualist, but I'm a dualist. I'm really not a dualist, even though I'm saying something totally dualistic. Yeah, I recognize that you got to have a mind and the brain. The brain has to have a mind and the mind has to have a brain. But I'm still talking about them as though they're separate stuff.
Terrence, have you seen Robert Lawrence Kuhn's landscape taxonomy?
Yes.
What were you thinking?
In fact, before he produced it, I had him give a talk in a conference I was running, in which he laid out the story.
Okay.
What I should say, the story is just a list. It's just a list of ways to come at it. I think it's a great value, but I think the value of it is that we can now say, let's throw away 99% of it.
Tomorrow I'm actually, he told me to email him tomorrow just to remind him we're going to have a conversation soon. What are your thoughts on the taxonomy in general?
No, I think it's a great way to do it. Taxonomies drive me crazy because they don't explain anything.
Yes, it's just it's really to show you what's out there.
Yeah. And on the other hand, it's great because we know what's out there. He lists me twice in that one. I'm listed twice in two different topics.
I think I saw that, and I wondered whether that was on purpose or.
Yeah, he did it on purpose. Yeah, it was not an accident. He told me. He says, "I'm doing it on purpose. Look at these." So no,
twice.
I like it a lot. I think it's great. And I think it needed to be done. We needed to have something like that, where somebody put it all together and said, this is the whole collection.
He beat me to it. I was planning something similar, but slightly different, but he really got there before me. But obviously.
Right. So part of the issue is what I call sort of a meta-analysis of his meta-analysis. The question is, how did he come up with the categories?
Yes.
What's the logic of the categories?
I'm going to make notes now, because this is going to be my approach.
Okay. Is the logic of the categories simply created by the properties that are out there in each of these categories? But if that's true, it reifies all their properties, right? So the question is there an logic that is behind this, that's philosophical? His is a philosophical one. It breaks up in terms of mostly philosophical taxonomy categories. I would like to see a more constructive theory that says, okay, this set of theories are assumed in that set of theories, and this set of theories are assumed in this other set of theories, and there's a hierarchic relationship in which they're nested within each other or contrasted to each other by inclusion or exclusion relationships. Are there a set of principles to construct this taxonomy? Because he did construct a taxonomy, but like most taxonomies, it can sometimes be just, as critics of this have described it in biology, as butterfly collection. I got a lot of different butterflies, and I look at them. These are like each other. These are like each other. These are like each other. These are different. I just organize them in front of me. He's done that. That has to be done first. So I think his task is one that has to be done first.
I think there were a few people who disagreed with their placement in the
Oh,
text.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say that, the reason I'm in more than one place is that I'm not in any of those places.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for a number of these theories. But
Yeah, a
again,
lot of them overlap in many different ways, and a lot of them are way more different than we think they are in different ways.
yes, exactly. Even those in the same category.
Yes, exactly.
And so yeah, I think this is the first step. The next step is to do what you might call the meta taxonomy of the taxonomies. How is the taxonomy generated? It's a
That's going to be a project I'm going to put. That's going to be literally, I'm going to work on that.
good. I think that's a great one.
Try my best. But you, as a materialist, when you think about your view, you propose that consciousness is not simply an epiphenomenon of brain activity, but has a unique causal role. So
Absolutely,
as a
because it can't
materialist,
be separated.
how do you substantiate this with the materialist ontology? Just for those who assume that that's impossible to conceptualize together.
Because the materialist ontology is not complete. That's the incompleteness problem here. We've got to recognize that the materialist ontology ignores the absential relationships. Once you get over that, then it's fine. So I don't consider myself a, quote, materialist or a physicalist, whatever those mean, because we've already defined those in ways that exclude the possibility. Exclude the possibility that absential features are structuring what's there.
I recently, well, for the most part, was told that physicalism and materialism are different. This was by Professor John Joe McFadden when he spoke to me about his electromagnetic theory of consciousness, when he spoke about semi-field theory. And it didn't really occur to me until that moment when he said, like, if you think about this, electromagnetism, waves functioning, he's very much materialist, but not necessarily a physicalist, because you can't think of waves and electromagnetism as physical entities. And that's when I kind of thought, okay, these are actually quite different, yet similar.
They are, and yet, of course, as Einstein showed us, that one is the other.
Yes, exactly.
It's not that they're separable; they're just different phases of.
Many people consider them synonyms to just mean the same thing.
Yeah, and they're not, of course. But again, these are philosophical theories that have specific definitions, and you'll notice that neither of them have a place for representation. So there's, representational perspectives mostly are thought of as non-materialist perspectives, non-physicalist perspectives. And so the very taxonomy of these systems has made it impossible to make sense of it.
When you think of the broader philosophical implications of your teleodynamic framework, particularly in terms of how we understand intentionality and consciousness, what comes to mind?
I'm not sure of the question.
I'm saying so.
Ask it again.
What are the broader philosophical implications that come out of your work on teleodynamics and your view on consciousness in general and the mind from this teleodynamic perspective? Does that make any sense?
Big question. The metaphysical implications to some extent. I actually wrote a paper some years ago with a colleague called Steps to a Metaphysics of what's it called? Steps to But basically, it's about what are the metaphysical assumptions of the teleodynamic approach. And one of them is that we have to embrace paradox. That this strange loop that I'm talking about is the most basic aspect of what existence is about. And it's effectively paradoxical because it's necessarily self-reflective and self-undermining at the same time. This is the Escherian, Gödelian kind of problem. Why my book was called Incomplete Nature. The Gödelian story says that things are incompletable, that reality is necessarily incomplete, and that means time. Incomplete means that what is here now is incomplete. It can't be enough. Time is necessary. The problem with the metaphysical implications here, and this is the metaphysical implications of emergence as well, the concept of emergence. Emergence is about incompleteness. It's not enough. It can always be more. It can always be different. You have to go all the way back to the Greeks to find out that the concept of change itself is inconceivable. And yet it's necessary. Why is that the case? Well, because change is that what is not. What is will become what is not. Self-undermining. The present undermines itself to become the future. That's this strange loop paradox. But what it means about time is something very interesting, it seems to me. I think of time as incompletable dimensionality. Hard to make sense of that, but think of it this way. I was a real fan of Einsteinian theory. I still am. Einstein just blows my mind, his thinking. And yet, we deeply disagree about how he thinks about time. Yet time was the essential idea in his theories. And this Lorentzian collapsing of space and time together into, quote, space-time, this four-dimensional manifold that becomes the real basis of his work, especially in general relativity, I think is fundamentally wrong. And it's wrong in the following sense. When somebody initially tried to explain the Einsteinian theory about time, he said, well, just thinking about what they call light cones and things like that. He said, now imagine that the world is a two-dimensional world, and that time is how one two-dimensional plane becomes another two-dimensional plane, becomes another two-dimensional plane. That time is the third dimension in which these spaces, these two-dimensional spaces, come one after the other, after the other, after the other. This creates what some people have called a block universe. That we've got a three-dimensional block made up of two-dimensional universes. And time is following a line through this block from dimension to dimension to dimension. I thought about this, and then I asked myself the following question. Okay, I know why we're not everywhere, but I don't know why we're not every when. Being a point on one of these tells me that's why I'm not everywhere. But the line, why am I not every when? Well, this can be answered because the real issue is here. No, I'm only in this when, this point, this space at this time. But why? How can I explain how I go from this point to this point to this point to this point on the timeline in my block universe? The answer is, well, I have to have another dimension. I have to have time. Because if I'm not every when, at this point in time, I have an extra dimension that keeps track of why I'm only here. And why I'm only here, I need that dimension to say, now I'm there, now I'm there, now I'm there. To not be every when, I have to have another dimension. But I can now say the same thing with that dimension.
Infinite regress.
Yeah, it's an infinite regress. I think time is incompletable dimensionality. That is, we always have to not explain why I'm not every when. I need to have that piece. Now, in that piece, I do a complicated construction of what I think time is about. And I think it has to do with understanding paradox and this strange loop-like relationship. But that means that if the universe is incompletable not just in time, but incompletable in dimensionality, then emergence is a given. newness is always there. You can't have a world without newness. Things emerge. Things are different than they were. And they will always be different than they were because it's incompletable. Because even dimensionality, even building a more complicated, 10-dimensional space-time continuum is not going to do it.
Yes, like noveltiness is the norm.
Yeah, you can't. It's because of incomplete nature. Nature is fundamentally incomplete at its very root.
Based on this work, what do you see as the most promising directions future research or cognitive scientists or philosophers of mind can take this and go with it?
I'm mostly in an area, I know neuroscience pretty well. That's my training. And I know evolutionary biology, and I'm getting better and better at understanding molecular biology and evolutionary theory. There's a lot to learn. So I'm not sure I have a lot to offer in this respect. And yet, I do think this will help us rethink what we call computation.
Mm.
We know how minds work. But we know also that they're about their own embodiment. They're about their own physicality. We have built these devices to be tools that don't have that feature. And that's why they're reliable tools. But this does mean that the physicality can be brought back into it in a more and more complete way. I'm not suggesting that's a good thing. But it means that we can understand the difference between computing and thinking this way. But we can ultimately probably generate devices that think and feel and know.
When you speak of the mind as a process, and I see it very much similarly in that regard. It's this dynamic process rather than a static entity just existing as this Ian Vitale type of phenomenon.
Yeah.
How does this perspective influence cognitive science or cognitive functions like memory, decision-making, perception? Because, it's an important way to conceive of this problem and then thereafter apply it to AI.
Well, and I think that the two realms are very different in where we will go with the two realms. But because my interest in the nervous system, I'm beginning to pay much more attention about how metabolism plays a role in thinking.
Mm.
And how thinking changes metabolism of the brain. And so a lot of our recent research has been looking at to what extent changes in blood flow and oxygenation are changing thinking and attention, when it's actually metabolism that's the initial driver, and that neural activity are secondary. I think this will help us understand disturbances of the nervous system, particularly things like schizophrenia and depression and so on. Why? Because these are also metabolic problems. And I think understanding that is an important issue, and to recognize that when I change my attention, it's not just that there's sort of a change in information going on, but blood flow is changing all over the brain. And to learn how that's controlled, I think gives us a hint as to why there is such a thing as feeling, as emotion, as the sense of doing something, of being here, and not being, in a sense, in a coma. And that is because the feeling is the resistance. There's the dissonance between the information that's being processed and the metabolism that's necessary to support it and is being resisted by it. So we recognize that when I feel something, it's because there's resistance. Pushing against something, or something is pushing against me, and there's a kind of inertia. It's not a surprise that we think of the term about feeling as we use the term emotion. It's got inertia attached to it. When I've got a strong emotion, it's got a kind of inertia to it. I can't stop it. And in part, that's because there's metabolism behind it. there's work being done. Work requires oxygen and glucose. We got to spend a lot more time understanding the nervous system at that level, and understanding this entanglement between the metabolism and what neurons are doing. But to flip this around to the computer world, one of the things that we know about, I was talking to people about supercomputers many years ago, and the one I was interested in is one they're explaining. It's in this big refrigerated room. I've got to have it's got these big, massive refrigeration systems to keep it cool, because the thousands and thousands of CPUs it's using, because it's so distributed, they heat up as they run their flops, and their transistors are turning over. They're generating heat. The process of computing is a thermodynamic process. They need to cool it because, if they get hot, and as they get hot, they get noisy. They don't do so well. You lose signal. I said, well, that's interesting. You've got these huge refrigerators running, using lots of energy, and you've got these huge computing systems using lots of energy and generating heat. Couldn't you just put a thermistor on each of the CPUs and take that information about heat, about the work it's doing, and sending it back to a central processor and say, this is part of the signal. Part of the work of computing is heat. And this is information about the work you're doing. And therefore, couldn't you use this to sort of redistribute the work? To say, oh, make that one a little quieter and turn this one up a little bit. Instead of just thinking of the heat as waste, the heat is actually information. It's about the physiology of computing. Now, it's a trivial part of this strange loop, but it's a part of recognizing the non-Cartesian nature of this process, that it's a physical process, and that it's got physical correlates. And those physical correlates also can be constraints and can be used to do work. And it can be used to produce new constraints that are new computing features. Now, to my knowledge, I don't know if anybody's ever used this logic, but it's the kind of logic that this would suggest.
Yes.
Once you recognize the hylomorphic nature of all of this, that's an obvious next step.
It is. Are you familiar with the work done by Mark Solms, Terrence?
A little bit. He and I communicated back in the 90s in my Symbolic Species days when he was in New York. And we have not been, I haven't followed his work since then, and I'm not sure that he's followed my work.
What you're talking about right now, at this point, towards the end of this conversation, is very similar to what the work he does. He focuses on homeostasis and affect being a very important part of feeling, being a fundamental feature of consciousness and reality and the way we perceive the world. So the focus is fundamentally on that homeostatic evolutionary, on almost the ancient part of the way we got to where we are. It's less cortical. He's less concerned about this cortical fallacy, is what he calls it, but rather this has been happening for a longer period over time. And
I agree with that. Yeah.
And we've merely played the cortex now, and that's because we think reason and intelligence is the biggest fundamental aspect of consciousness.
All right, brain's been around long before cortex.
Yeah, exactly.
But here's the interesting thing, that if we're talking about it in information terms alone, I don't think there's any such thing as feeling there. I think it's always about work and resistance.
And I love the way you've managed to make that physical in terms of a legitimate equation at that point. It's like it's when you bring in maths and physics into this, it's a lot harder to just dismiss it.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
when I remember reading your work, it's years ago, and then often read throughout the years. When you were growing up, who were the people you looked up to? You mentioned a few people already in your journey: Noam Chomsky, Fodor, a lot of people who've been part of this. Well, not necessarily.
They've been mostly the absential, the negative part, the part that I've worked
Exactly,
against.
the ones who have formed the beliefs,
But
but
no, I would say that there are a bunch of early ones. One of the early effects was reading Arthur Kessler's book, The Act of Creation. He wrote it in '64. Kessler was a novelist and an essayist. Became very much interested in anti-reductionism later in his life. But his book, Act of Creation, was something he started in the late 40s, and I guess took him like 10, 12 years, 15 years to write. Because sort of like my problem. You think about one thing and it leads to something else and leads to something else and leads to... He wrote it initially because he wanted to explain why jokes, discovery, and art are like each other. These are all involved in the act of creation and the experience of this sort of the ha-ha experience with jokes, the aha experience with discovery, and the experience with art. And he said, where do they come from? And he came up with this idea of what he called bisociation. It's this juxtaposition of opposites and incompatibilities in a way that resolves in three possible ways. And he then went on to say, but that tells us something about the cognitive process of the creative process. And he then begins to look at how various artists and scientists and humorists create. And then he begins thinking about, well, what does that mean about thought processes? And how is that related to biology? And is this a little bit like the regrowth of limbs on salamanders that have lost their limbs? And because it's all about these creative processes, these generative processes. Well, so I read this as a young teenager, and I went, whoa, this is so wild. Interestingly enough, this book was required reading at Harvard in the late 60s. I don't know that anybody remembers it, but it got me going in this direction. What got me going after this is coming in contact with a man named Gregory Bateson. And Gregory Bateson, I first of all read his stuff, reading about complex systems theory. What's that?
Is his dad not William Bateson?
Yes, his dad is William Bateson, the geneticist.
Yes.
Gregory Bateson was once a husband to Margaret Mead, the anthropologist. He and Margaret split up, but they both attended this series of conferences called the Macy Conferences in the 40s and 50s. This is Josiah Macy, and who's, I guess it was his son, put this together. It was to talk about what was then called teleonomy, information theory, and complex systems theory in the beginning of computation stuff that was beginning in the late 40s and early 50s. And they were trying to put it together with theories of culture, of mind, of biology, and that sort of thing. Really a productive group. So you can find the information about the Macy's conferences online, but it's where I would say systems theory thinking got into all these other domains. So Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson. Gregory was initially an anthropologist himself, but then became much more interested in information theory and stuff. And I came in contact with him initially by picking up his book, Steps to an Ecology of Mind. His idea that mental processes were like ecological processes, that we ought to think about biology and ecology and economy and mentality with the same tools. And it was just a collection of his essays, but they were so mind-blowing that I became immediately interested. I eventually found a guy who was one of his students, a fellow who was at the time in British Columbia and wrote a book called System and Structure, based upon Bateson's ideas, and in the early 70s, taking in structuralism and Marxism and economic theory and trying to figure out if they all fit together. His name was Anthony Wilden. And Wilden then introduced me to Bateson eventually. And I became a total acolyte in this area. But then, and this is what's weird. This has to do with a one of these strange moments in history that happens to many of us. As a college student, I was poor, supporting myself, couldn't buy books. And so to read the latest things that are out there, I couldn't find them in the library because, of course, they were just published. So what I have to do is I have to go and sit in the bookstore, take a book off the shelf and read it while I'm sitting there in the bookstore. So this became, my study area. And I remember going to the bookstore and I was reading books about, the other person who was really influential at the time was W. Ross Ashby and his introduction to cybernetics and his design of a brain and that kind of stuff, taking cybernetic theory and trying to make it sensible, link it up with information theory and so on. All of this stuff and complex systems theory and starting to read the beginnings of genetics that were developing in the 70s and so on. All this was exciting. So I was sitting in the bookstore reading these things. And the guy was stacking books in the bookstore, who I think was sort of on the spectrum, not a very good communicator, but really, apparently really knew what he was doing. I would find him, suddenly he would be behind me, looking over my shoulder, and he would say, "Oh, you're reading that. You should read Peirce." And I went, "What do you mean, Peirce?" And he said, well, Peirce is a philosopher. And I said, well, at the time, I don't read philosophy. I'm into science here, none of that stuff. And so I would go on with my reading and I'd pick up another book and again, week after week, there'd be a time he'd show up and he said, "Oh, you're reading this one now, but you should look at Peirce."
It's almost like a Google ad.
Yeah, exactly. And I went, "Stop bothering me. You're a weird guy. You couldn't possibly know what's going on." And finally, I picked up a book that was by a neuroscientist, Warren McCulloch, called Embodiments of Mind. And as I was reading through it, I came into the later chapter, and it was all about Peirce. I went, "Oh my God." And so he comes around me again, and I said, "Okay, I get it. Give me something to read about Peirce." And so he went over to the philosophy section. He pulls out this book. He said, "Here's a collection of some of Peirce's work. Take a look at this." I started to read it, and I went, "Oh my God. This is all the stuff that all these guys thought they were talking about and that they were ignoring, and that this guy 75 years ago was writing about and had seen through these problems." And I went, "Oh, I got to learn Peirce." So I dropped out. I was in college. I dropped out and I took all the money I had and I bought the only set of books of all of Peirce's writings.
Oh,
It's collected volumes. They're produced by Harvard University Press.
that's quite
and I spent, I don't know if it was a full year, but a long time just sort of struggling through it. It was a mess. It was terrible. This guy is a horrible writer, and brilliant, and a despicable guy. Nobody liked him. And so most of his work was never published, interestingly enough.
I've never read Peirce personally. I'm looking forward to checking this out afterwards.
So here's what I did. After this, I went back to school and I wrote a senior thesis on Peirce's philosophy, particularly his semiotic theory and its relationship to cybernetic theory. It's called semiosis. It's called Cybernetics and Semiotics: The Relevance of C.S. Peirce.
I'm going to start.
And I'll send it to you because although I disagree with some of Peirce's thinking, particularly his metaphysical thinking, I find it troublesome in some respects. But the semiotic theory just blew me away. And so I, as a young, now just recently graduated, I did my senior work, I graduated, I got out of there. I applied to Harvard and I sent this off and I said, I want to work with somebody that knows Peirce's work. And this philosopher named Israel Scheffler said, "Okay, come into my program." And so here I am, this nobody from the Northwest, a small little college, out of the way, goes to Harvard, drives across country with my newborn daughter and my wife in an old VW van. A weird story. And what I was going to Harvard to do was to study with somebody about this. And I had just learned that all of Peirce's unpublished work was in a library at Harvard called the Houghton Library. in just manuscript copies of handwritten material. I thought, wow, this is where I want to be. I got there studying with this guy, spending time with the other philosophers that were there, brilliant people. You know, there was Willard Van Orman Quine, the logician, who I studied with briefly. There was Hilary Putnam, who I studied with briefly, took a seminar from these guys. Never worked out, as
Those
it didn't work out with
those
Chomsky
are
or Fodor.
legends in the field. I mean, you mentioning.
Yeah, I know. It's amazing, but that's the power of being in a place like that. You get to rub elbows with these guys that sort of blow your socks off.
I think one of Quine's quotes I remember was studying the human mind without studying abnormal mental phenomena is basically like scratching the surface of nothing. I mean, you're just literally just looking into nowhere.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's an N of one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course.
But anyway, the long and short of this is that I was unable to get to Peirce's unpublished papers. I was a nobody. I can't put my hands on this valuable stuff. So I gave up and I shifted.
Terrence, were there people who were allowed to actually touch it?
So eventually, yes.
Okay.
Now, and it's a lot of stuff has moved to Indiana, where they've been trying to put it together. And the other problem with the early Peirce work that I read is it was organized topically, not historically, not in terms of how he was thinking in time, not his. So stuff that he was thinking early in his life is next to stuff that he's thinking at the end of his life. And you had to sort of read the notes at the bottom to find out when it was. And so I had to also reconstruct how he reconstructed his thinking with this. Luckily, there was one author that tried to come up with the history of Peirce's thoughts at the time that helped me a little bit. But I was unable to do that, and so I jumped ship. Philosophy is not where I'm going to go. I'm going to do evolution and evolution of the brain. So I'm going to take courses in neuroscience. I'm going to take courses in evolutionary biology. And this is when I also stopped taking courses from people like Chomsky and Fodor. No, this is just philosophy. I'm going to leave that behind. But the Peircean influence has been with me ever since.
And then when you enter the new realm of evolutionary biology, who became your new heroes and icons in the field?
I was very, very lucky at the time. So at the time at Harvard, this is when the big arguments around sociobiology were brewing. So I got to work briefly with Steve Gould, with Dick Lewontin, with Edward Wilson, and for a year, Bill Hamilton came to give a set of talks. I had this great class a lecture class with William Hamilton and Robert Trivers. I don't know if you know who Trivers is. Trivers, as far as I could tell, never gave a lecture unstoned. And I'll see if I can describe this scene. Here we are in this big lecture hall, and there's a stage and all these blackboards over the back of the stage. Bill Hamilton comes up and he says a few words, turns to the blackboard and starts writing equations, talking. And that's the rest of the hour lecture. Bob Trivers comes up in the next lecture, sits down on the front of the stage with his legs hanging over, with his sandals, and starts free associating about evolutionary theory and about Hamilton's theory of kin selection and so on, and what it means and so on. A totally weird juxtaposition, but incredible. At the same time, I'm starting to make friends with Steve Gould and Dick Lewontin, who hate this stuff.
Steve Gould definitely hated those. I remember him.
Yeah.
Just like,
and yet Steve Gould was himself brilliant.
Yes. Wonderful.
Dick Lewontin, brilliant. And so here you've got brilliant ideas warring with each other. People that don't like each other. And yet they're all doing great stuff. So I was in the camp with the evolutionary biologists. So Gould was sort of not in my camp, but I had to know what he was talking about.
Yes.
And I got a lot from him. And I would say that I've, after he passed, rediscovered a whole lot of stuff that I now realize was there that I hadn't paid attention to.
Mm.
But he was sort of at the outs among the Harvard biologists. They didn't like him because, he didn't get grants. He didn't do lab research. He didn't do field research. He was just writing these popularized things. And his students even got support mostly from his popularization. So, it wasn't, and yet he had this incredible mind, this incredible sort of crossover from the philosophical, the historical, put all this stuff together in just a wonderful way. And so, I've gained a lot from that. But so I was in the middle of this. It was a great place to be because I got to listen to all these people talking to me, like trying to convince me about why I should not think that. And these guys are trying to convince me that I should not think that. It was a terrific place to be.
And you, of course, then went through that rise and fall of behaviorism at the same time.
Oh, exactly. So behaviorism was just collapsing. This is the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. Behaviorism was on its way out. And so I also got to study with developmental psychologists. In fact, one of my, I would say the closest confidant was a guy named Sheldon White, who was a developmental psychologist who was studying the historical development of developmental psychology, and sort of recognizing, how we were changing our thinking about how minds developed. At the same time, Piagetian psychology was all the rage at Harvard. And so I took classes from Piagetian psychologists and from linguists who were interested in child development of language. So it was a great time to be in the middle of all of this. And that's why I did my research, tracing connections in monkey brains. Because I thought, well, now you could do something empirical to sort of pursue this. I became very disappointed in the developmental psychologists, in part because they were treating the brain of a child as the brain of an adult that just didn't have enough input yet. And so now Piaget says, well, you develop these ideas, and these ideas follow, then these ideas follow. These stages follow one after the other. And that's because of, the ideas, the knowledge that's being accumulated by assimilation and accommodation, and so on. But in fact, children's brains are very different than adult brains.
Yeah.
And two-year-old brains are radically different. And so as I began studying brain evolution, I realized, evolution doesn't go from adult brain to adult brain to adult brain. It goes from adult brain to a child brain to maturing, differentiating to an adult brain to produce another child brain that differentiates. And the brains of youngsters are very different. And the developmental process constrains how evolution can actually work, what can actually evolve. So in my PhD work, which eventually contributed years and years later to the Symbolic Species, was recognizing that you can't understand evolution unless you understand development. You can't understand how brains evolve unless you understand how brains develop, because the developmental process will determine and constrain how the evolutionary process can take place. The Evo-Devo perspective.
Yes.
I was thinking Evo-Devo at a time when, the term wasn't there, but it was a necessary part. There was a bunch of us all over the world, of course, being hit by this Evo-Devo problem. That Steve Gould had already talked about, that Steve Gould was already aware of as a problem, but just historically, going back to Haeckel and going back to his problems of neoteny and so on, which I think were dead ends ultimately, but nevertheless, he recognized that this was a problem. So this is what I'm saying. It was a terrific time to be there.
Yeah,
I got this awe.
You're part of quite a massive, it's almost like this Mount Rushmore era of philosophy and science coming together. With that gives you this unique perspective. And I think like a nice closing question would be, what's your thoughts on this relationship between philosophy and science at this point? How do you see these two fields coming together or moving away from each other?
Which they're both doing, sadly.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of good philosophy of science out there. And one of the things that's happening in the field is a lot of philosophers, young philosophers, are going to study with scientists, going to hang out in labs and trying to figure out how it's done. I'm not sure that's the way it should go. The real problem with science, as I see it, the technical sciences, is that we often know so little of the philosophy. And as a result, we how should I say, we reinvent the wheel again and again and again and again. Ideas were thought 100 years ago come back again and again because we haven't realized that, no, you can think yourself outside of that box if you're careful. So I think the sciences lack that. And philosophy, of course, gets to be too preoccupied with itself and not looking. So that I have not really a sense that the two will come together. I think they're separate planes. They'll run separately, but there will be interaction. I mean, I'm somebody who I would say that I can't not be in both realms in my thinking. And that's probably because of my background, but probably because, I flirt between all these areas.
I think deep down, you still love the philosophy, even though you are more of a scientist.
No, I would say, and I think people have oftentimes they look at people like me and say, oh, he's a scientist that's gone into philosophose. He's no longer, you can't trust him because he's just thinking philosophical things. A lot of us, who have a scientific background that begin to sort of ask the questions that we never asked when we were younger. Our thought of, okay, they're getting old, they're doddering, forget what they're thinking. I think that's a mistake, but I realize I'm probably in that ballpark as well.
No, I agree with you. I mean, that even happens to me as a doctor when I talk about philosophical, even if I speak about idealist theories of consciousness with other guests, when I go back to work, I have friends who just who think I'm completely out of my mind just because of
exactly.
It's got nothing to do with medicine, so they just think I'm crazy, which is pretty cool to see how ignorance.
Well, and the other thing that happens, and this happened in my career, that most people who know about my fetal neural transplantation work, or my developmental brain research, or my comparative brain anatomy work, don't know that I think any of these philosophical thoughts. The people that have read Incomplete Nature have no idea that I actually spent decades, doing laboratory research with, neurons, fetal neurons, and measuring the structure of that structure in the brain, or doing tracer work. Nobody knows about that work. And then in the 90s, I was doing all this work in transplantation, and part of it was medical, of course. It was a lot of it was about Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease, and maybe we could use cell transplantation methods to deal with these diseases. So people know of my work in that realm, and then they wonder why I left it. Why am I not still doing this stuff? That's the problem. If you've got too many lives, people don't know that you've had all these lives. But all of these lives have influenced my thinking in each of these realms.
Yeah. Thanks, Terrence. Thank you so much. This was an absolutely wonderful conversation. You've been such an amazing guest. I really appreciate your time.
All right. Well, we'll get back to it at some point.
I will definitely, and I look forward to our round two. I can't wait for it. Thanks so much.
I'll send you a couple of papers to whet your appetite for the next cycle.
I can't wait. I'm excited.
Okay.
Please send them as soon as possible. Cheers, Terrence.
All right.